Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been trying to write this down for weeks, but every time I start, I get this knot in my stomach. Even now, my hands are shaking, but I need to share this. I'm a pretty experienced hiker, been exploring various national forests for nearly 7 years now. Never had any issues beyond the usual. Bad weather, a twisted ankle once, running low on water. But what happened 3 weeks ago? I still can't wrap my head around it. I was hiking alone in redacted national forest. It was a Wednesday, and I'd taken the day off work specifically because I wanted the trails to myself. This particular area isn't heavily trafficked even on weekends. It's mostly game trails connecting to the official paths. I've hiked there maybe a dozen times before without incident. The weather was perfect that day, around 65 degrees, partly cloudy, with this amazing crisp smell in the air that you only get in old-growth forests. I'd been on the trail for about 2 hours when things started getting weird. The first thing I noticed was a crashing sound in the underbrush behind me. Not unusual in itself, probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, I thought. But then I realized the sound was following a pattern. When I walked, I heard the crashing. When I stopped, it stopped too, exactly matching my movements. I tried to convince myself it was just an echo or my imagination, but after the 5th or 6th time, there was no denying it. Something was pacing me. I picked up my speed a little, not wanting to run and trigger a predator response if it was a bear or mountain lion. The trail wound through a particularly dense section of woods before opening into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. I was about halfway through this clearing when I heard a whoosh through the air and something hit the ground about 10 feet ahead of me. It took me a second to process what I was seeing, a rock roughly the size of a softball that definitely hadn't been there before. My first thought was ridiculous. Maybe some hiker was playing a prank, but I knew I was alone out there. I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead, and these weren't the kind of trails casual hikers used. I stood frozen for maybe 30 seconds, staring at the rock, when I heard another crash in the brush, this time closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I decided to keep moving, thinking whatever it was might lose interest if I just kept going. Big mistake. As I continued down the trail, the footsteps behind me got heavier, more deliberate. Not like a deer or even a bear. These were, I don't know how else to describe it except to say they sounded purposeful, and they were getting closer, that fast. I glanced back and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A massive dark figure stepped onto the trail, maybe 50 yards behind me. It was only visible for a moment before it moved back into cover, but that glimpse was enough to stop me cold. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that tall, and it wasn't a person either. The proportions were all wrong. I think I must have stood there for several seconds trying to process what I'd just seen. When it happened, from behind me came this sound of rushing movement, like something large charging through the underbrush. The footsteps were like hammers hitting the ground, and there was this huffing sound, not like an animal panting, but more like forceful exhalations, almost aggressive. Before I could even think about running, it burst out onto the trail behind me. I spun around and nearly collapsed from shock. It stopped abruptly about 20 feet away, rocking forward on its feet like it was restraining itself from coming closer. And then it... God, I still get chills thinking about it. It bared its teeth and let out this deep, guttural roar that I felt in my chest. I've never felt so small in my entire life. This thing was enormous. Its shoulders must have been at least 4 feet wide, blocking most of the trail. Arms hanging down to its knees. It was covered in dark brown fur, with this reddish tint where the sun hit it, and its face, not quite human, not quite ape, something in between that shouldn't exist. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it backed away into the brush at the side of the trail. But it didn't leave. I could hear it moving parallel to the trail, breaking branches, huffing. I stood there, completely paralyzed with fear. Should I run, stay still, try to look big and intimidating? Nothing in my experience had prepared me for this. I decided my best option was to keep moving forward, away from it but not running. Just a steady pace. I'd gone maybe 20 yards when a rock sailed out of the trees to my right, landing with a thud on the trail beside me. Then another, this one bigger, hitting a tree to my left with enough force to take off a chunk of bark. The thing was throwing rocks at me. For the next half hour, the longest 30 minutes of my life, this stalking continued. Every time the terrain opened up a bit, providing less cover, the Bigfoot, because what else could it possibly be, would rush forward in another display. It would crash through the brush, stopping short of actually attacking me, then throw rocks, push over saplings and roar. Each time it seemed to be testing my reaction, gauging how frightened I was. I was beyond frightened. I was in a state of terror I didn't even know was possible. My body was moving on autopilot while my mind tried to make sense of what was happening. I came to a small creek crossing, just a shallow stream about 6 feet across with stepping stones. As I carefully crossed, trying not to slip, rocks began splashing into the water around me. It was still following, still watching, still toying with me. Just after crossing the creek, I heard a tremendous crash behind me. I turned to see a log, not a branch, but an actual log that would have taken several men to move, lying across the creek where I'd just been. The thing had thrown it. The strength required to do that was unfathomable. I kept walking, trying to remember the trail map in my head. I knew there was a service road that intersected the trail maybe a mile ahead. If I could reach that, maybe I'd be safer in the more open terrain. The pattern continued, me walking as steadily as I could manage. The Bigfoot pacing me in the woods, occasionally making bluff charges or throwing objects. During one charge, it got close enough that I could smell it. A powerful, musky odor mixed with something like wet dog and something else I can't describe. Each time it displayed, it seemed to be getting more frustrated that I wasn't running. At one point, it stood at the edge of the trail and beat its chest with its fists. Not like a gorilla in the movies, this was more like slapping its upper body with open hands, making this hollow, thumping sound. I was about half a mile from the service road when things escalated. The creature rushed out again, this time getting within 10 feet of me. It was so close I could see the steam from its breath in the cool air. It opened its mouth wide and let out a roar so loud it hurt my ears. I could see every detail: yellowed teeth, pink gums, a tongue that looked surprisingly human. Its eyes were deep-set and dark, but unmistakably intelligent. For a split second I thought, this is it, this is how I die. But then, like before, it backed off, though this time it didn't immediately disappear into the woods. It stood there, swaying slightly, watching me. I got the distinct impression it was trying to decide something. I don't know where I found the courage, but I spoke to it. Not words, really, just a low, steady, "Whoa, easy," like you might say to calm a spooked horse. Its head tilted slightly, almost like it was confused by the sound of my voice. Then it snorted, turned, and moved back into the trees, though I could still hear it pacing me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 more minutes, I finally reached the service road, a wider, graveled path used by forest rangers. As soon as I stepped onto it, the sounds of my pursuer began to fade. It was backing off. I didn't run until I was sure it was gone. Then I practically sprinted the 3 miles back to my car. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life. I haven't been back to those woods since. I can't bring myself to go hiking alone anymore. I've told a few close friends, but most just think I encountered a bear and my mind filled in the details. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something that shouldn't exist, but does. And it was intelligent enough to stalk me, to intimidate me, to herd me out of its territory without actually harming me. I still wake up hearing that roar, still see those eyes when I close mine, still wonder what would have happened if I'd run. Story 2. I still get goosebumps talking about what happened last August. It's been over a year, but the memory is crystal clear, like it happened yesterday. I can't explain what I saw, but I know what I experienced was real. It was late August of 2019, and I had a few days off work. Michigan summers are too beautiful to waste indoors, so I decided to head up to the Huron-Manistee National Forests for some solo fishing. I'd been there a few times before, but usually stuck to the more populated lakes. This time, I wanted real solitude and better fishing, so I picked this remote lake that a buddy at work had mentioned had amazing bass fishing. I packed light, just my tackle box, a small cooler with sandwiches and water, and my trusty fishing rod. Left home around 10 in the morning, drove about 3 hours north. The roads got narrower and bumpier the deeper I went into the forest. I remember thinking how isolated it felt, but in a good way. The forest was thick on both sides of the dirt road, sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. I reached the lake around 1 in the afternoon. It was even more secluded than I expected. No other cars in the small clearing that served as a makeshift parking area. Perfect. I unloaded my small aluminum boat from my truck bed and dragged it to the water's edge. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water surrounded by dense forest. The pines and hardwoods created this wall of green that reflected on the surface. I motored out to this quiet cove on the northern edge of the lake. My co-worker had specifically mentioned this spot, said the base there were practically jumping into boats. The shoreline curved inward, creating a sheltered area with steep banks in places, thick with vegetation right down to the water. I dropped anchor about 30 feet from shore and settled in. The fishing was decent. I caught a couple smallmouth bass in the first hour. Nothing huge, but enough to keep it interesting. The day was warm, but not hot, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. Time sort of melted away as I sat there. I remember checking my watch around 5 and being surprised how late it had gotten. That's when things started to get weird. I was baiting my hook when I heard movement along the shoreline, not just leaves rustling in the wind, but the distinct sound of twigs snapping and undergrowth being pushed aside. It sounded heavy, like something big was moving through the trees. My first thought was deer. They're all over these forests, and it was about the right time of day for them to come down to the water. I kept fishing, but kept glancing toward the shore. The sound stopped after a minute or so, and I figured whatever it was had either moved on or was standing still. No big deal. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard a loud splash about 30 feet away. I turned, expecting to see a fish jumping, but the ripple pattern looked wrong. It was too round, too solid, like a rock had dropped straight down into the water. Before I could even process that thought, there was another splash, closer to my boat. Then, a third. I realized these weren't fish. Someone, or something, was throwing rocks into the water. My first reaction was irritation. I thought maybe some kids had hiked out there and were messing with me. "Hey!" I shouted toward the shoreline. "Cut it out!" No response. Just silence, not even birds chirping anymore, which I now realize should have been my first serious warning sign. I stared at the tree line, trying to spot movement. The forest was thick, right up to the water's edge, creating deep shadows even though it was still daylight. Another rock hit the water, this one landing maybe 10 feet from my boat. Then another, even closer. These weren't small pebbles either. They were making big splashes, heavy enough that one of them actually rocked my boat a bit when it landed close by. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt very, very wrong. I scanned the shoreline more carefully, squinting to see through the shadows between the trees. That's when I saw it. Movement between two large pines, something big, something upright. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever I was looking at, it wasn't a person, at least not a normal-sized one. The shape was all wrong, too big, too broad. My mind raced through possibilities. A hunter in bulky gear, someone in a ghillie suit, but no gear makes someone that size. Another rock splashed, this one hitting the side of my boat with a loud thunk. The boat rocked sharply, and my tackle box slid across the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I was about 25 feet from shore, close enough that I could make out details in the tree line. That's when it stepped forward just slightly, just enough for me to see it more clearly in a patch of dappled sunlight. I froze, completely froze. What I saw doesn't make sense, but I swear it was there. It was tall, impossibly tall. I'm 6 feet, and this thing towered over what a person should be, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were broader than any man I've ever seen, and its body was massive, not fat, but solid, powerful, and it was covered, completely covered, in dark hair, not clothes. Hair, dark brown or black, I couldn't tell in the shadows. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was partially obscured by a low-hanging branch. But I could feel it watching me. There was intelligence in that gaze, deliberate, focused. It wasn't just some animal that had wandered to the water's edge. It knew I was there, and it was intentionally throwing rocks at me. Time seemed to stop as we stared at each other. I don't know if it lasted seconds or minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my fishing rod on the floor of the boat. I watched, paralyzed, as the creature raised one arm, a massive long limb, and hurled another rock with incredible force. This one hit the bow of my boat dead on, making a sound like a hammer on metal. The boat rocked violently. That was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. Pure survival instinct kicked in. I lunged for the anchor line with trembling hands, nearly tipping the boat in my panic. The rope was slippery and my fingers felt numb, but I managed to pull it up. The whole time, I could feel those eyes on me, watching my every move. I yanked the starter cord on the outboard motor, praying it would catch. It sputtered once, twice, each second feeling like an eternity. I didn't dare look back at the shore. Another rock landed in the water just behind me, close enough to splash water into the boat. The motor finally roared to life, and I twisted the throttle as far as it would go. The boat lurched forward, nearly throwing me overboard. I grabbed the side to steady myself and finally looked back. The creature was still there, standing motionless at the water's edge, partially obscured by trees, but unmistakably present. It didn't chase or move. It just watched me flee. One final rock splashed in the water behind me as I sped away, as if to emphasize that it could have hit me if it wanted to. I raced across the lake, my heart feeling like it would explode. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. I kept looking back, terrified I'd see that thing swimming after me or running along the shoreline, but the tree line remained still. I reached the boat launch in record time, nearly running the boat aground in my hurry. I've never moved so fast in my life. Dragging the boat up onto shore, throwing my gear into the truck, not even bothering to secure the boat properly on the truck bed. I just used one strap, tightened it as fast as I could, and got the hell out of there. The drive home is a blur. I remember checking my rearview mirror constantly, convinced I'd see something massive step out onto the road behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over twice just to collect myself. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? I know what people would think. What I saw doesn't exist according to everything we're taught. But I know what I saw. I've spent hours researching online since then, looking at reports of similar encounters in Michigan's forests. There are more than you'd think. Some people have suggested it was a bear standing on its hind legs. I've seen bears. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't throw rocks with precision. They don't have that intelligent, deliberate gaze. And they certainly don't stand 8 feet tall with bodies shaped like massive humans. Others have suggested it was just some tall guy in the woods messing with me. But no human is built like what I saw. The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, moving with a fluidity that didn't seem human. I haven't been back to that lake. I haven't been fishing alone since then either. Something about being watched by that creature, being targeted by it, has shaken me to my core. It wasn't just the fear in the moment. It's the implications of what I saw. If that thing exists, what else is out there in the forest that we don't know about? Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling like I'm back in that boat, with rocks splashing all around me, feeling those eyes on me. I can still picture that massive silhouette, the arm raising to throw another rock, the impossible size and shape of it. I don't know what it was, I don't have a name for it. But I know it was real, and it was intelligent, and it wanted me to know I was in its territory. The scariest part is wondering how many other people have seen it, but like me, were too afraid of ridicule to come forward. All I know is that the forests of Michigan hold secrets, and I had the misfortune of discovering one of them. I just count myself lucky that all it did was throw rocks. Story 3. I still don't know why I'm writing this after all these years. Maybe I just need to get it out, put it somewhere besides my own head. I've never told the full story to anyone. Who would believe me anyway? But it's all true, every word of it. I built my house with my own 2 hands back in '78, near Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. Not a contractor-built cookie-cutter home. I mean, I literally built the damn thing myself, from foundation to roof. It sits on the very last paved road before everything turns to gravel. Past my property, there's nothing but forest, ridges, and old logging roads stretching for miles. No neighbors to speak of, just wilderness. By the mid-90s, I'd lived there for almost 20 years. I knew that land like the back of my hand, every creak in the house, every animal sound in the forest. I knew when a storm was coming before the weatherman did. You develop a 6th sense about your surroundings when you live alone in a place that long. It was late September of '95 when things started getting weird. I remember the date clearly because I'd just watched the Mariners beat the Angels in that playoff race, and I was in a good mood. I was sitting in my recliner, the one I'd positioned perfectly so I could watch TV and still see out the big picture window that faced the tree line about 60 yards from the house. The windows were open to let in the cool evening air. Around 10:30 at night, I got this feeling, hard to explain, but anyone who's ever been watched knows what I mean. The hair on your neck stands up, and you just know someone's eyes are on you. It was so strong and sudden that I put down the remote and stared out at the black outline of the trees. The outside lights were off, so I couldn't see much beyond the yard, just the dark mass of forest. Nothing moved but that feeling. It didn't go away. I must have sat there for 15 minutes, just staring into the darkness. Eventually I closed the windows, locked everything up tight and tried to brush it off, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next night, same thing happened. Same time, same feeling. By then, I was getting annoyed more than scared. I lived too far out for random hikers or teenagers to be lurking around, and we didn't have many transients out that way. It was too remote. The 3rd night is when things escalated. I was in the kitchen washing dishes around 9:30 when I caught movement in the reflection of the window above the sink. It was just a glimpse, but something big moved past outside. I spun around fast, looking out the window directly, and I saw a large, dark figure moving past the side of the house. Whatever it was, the top of its head was above the upper window frame, which I know for a fact is over 6.5 feet high. My heart nearly stopped. I immediately flipped the kitchen light off and stood there in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. After about 30 seconds, I could make out a wide shadow standing by the railing of my deck, completely still, not moving an inch, just standing there. I can't explain why, but I knew it was aware I'd seen it. After what felt like forever, but was probably half a minute, it moved down the steps and disappeared into the darkness toward the tree line. I didn't sleep a wink that night, kept my shotgun on the nightstand and got up to check the locks every hour or so. The next morning I went outside to look around. The ground was still damp from rain earlier in the week, and there were these faint, large impressions in the soil beside the deck. They were spaced wider than my stride, and I'm 6 foot tall. They weren't clear enough to make out any details, just depressions really, but they were definitely there. For the next couple weeks I started keeping all the curtains closed at night and made sure doors and windows were locked tight. I'd see shadows moving at the edge of the trees sometimes, but never got a good look. The feeling of being watched was constant though, especially once the sun went down. Then came that night in mid-October, the 15th to be exact. I'd actually managed to fall asleep around 11 and was out cold until something woke me up. It was around 1 in the morning according to the clock radio by my bed. What jolted me awake was a heavy thump against the side of the house, like something substantial had bumped into it. Then there was this scraping sound on my bedroom window. I froze, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The scraping stopped, and then I heard it. Deep, steady breathing from outside the window. Not animal panting, but slow, deliberate breaths. In, out, in, out. The kind of breathing that has intelligence behind it. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor of the house. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the outline of a face pressed against the glass. Not just any face, a head that took up nearly the whole upper section of the window. It had this sloped forehead with eyes set deep in shadow. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see they reflected faintly, not like a deer or cat's eyes, but with a dull glow. It had a big flat nose and dark skin with what looked like hair coming down the sides. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just staring at this thing that was staring back at me through my 2nd-story bedroom window. Then I remembered the flashlight I keep in my nightstand drawer. Moving as slowly and quietly as possible, I reached over, opened the drawer and grabbed it. The breathing outside continued, steady and unbroken. When I flicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the window, I saw its eyes, yellowish and reflective in the beam, before it jerked back from the window. In that brief moment of illumination, I saw leathery skin, coarse dark brown hair, and a face that was both eerily human-like and completely alien at the same time. The eyes were deep set under a prominent brow, intelligent but wild. Then it was gone, moving with surprising speed. I heard heavy footsteps on the side of the house, and then the sound of something large running toward the trees. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours, flashlight still pointed at the window, half expecting it to come back. When I finally worked up the courage, I went through the house, turning on every light, checking every lock, and grabbing my shotgun. I spent the rest of the night sitting at my kitchen table, facing the back door, waiting for morning. At first light, I went outside to look for evidence. The ground was too hard for footprints, but there were these weird, coarse brown hairs caught on the drain pipe that ran down the side of the house near my window. I still have them, sealed in a sandwich bag in my desk drawer. I've never shown them to anyone. The next few nights, I slept in the living room with all the lights on and my shotgun across my lap. Sometimes I'd feel that same presence outside, that sense of being watched. But whatever it was, stayed back in the trees. I installed thicker curtains on every window in the house and kept them closed tight as soon as the sun went down. I added motion sensor lights all around the property too. Over the years since then, I've occasionally heard strange vocalizations from the forest. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, something in between. I've found broken branches high up on trees where no human could reach without equipment. Twice I've come home to find my garbage cans tipped over and picked through, but not torn apart like a bear would do. What I saw that night wasn't human. The size alone, standing flat-footed and able to look in a second-story window, puts it at over 8 feet tall. The broad face, heavy brow, the hair-covered features. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind. and I always come to the same conclusion. What visited me that October night was what folks around here call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I still live in the same house, still keep to myself mostly, but I never sit with my back to a window anymore, even with the curtains closed, and sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can feel it out there in the trees, watching, waiting, remembering me just as clearly as I remember it. Some nights, I still wake up at exactly 1 a.m., my heart pounding for no reason. And every time I find myself staring at that same window, half expecting to see that face staring back at me again. Story 4. I can't believe I'm finally sharing this. It's been about 6 months since it happened, but I still find myself looking over my shoulder or freezing up when I hear unfamiliar sounds in the bush. What we saw that day on the beach has changed something in me, something fundamental about how I move through the natural world that's been my home all my life. For context, I live in a remote First Nations community in Northern Ontario. When I say remote, I mean truly isolated. No roads connect us to the outside world except for winter ice roads that are only usable a few months of the year. The rest of the time, it's fly-in only. Most people don't understand what that kind of isolation really means. It's not just inconvenient, it shapes your entire worldview. Out here, you learn to be self-sufficient, to respect the land, and to understand that nature isn't always benevolent. My girlfriend and I have been together for 3 years. We both grew up here, both know the land intimately, or at least we thought we did. There's a beach about 5 miles from our community that we visit sometimes. It's beautiful, quiet, and peaceful. Well, it used to be. It was a Saturday in late August. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. We decided to head to the beach in the afternoon, planning to stay until sunset. We packed some food, grabbed our blanket, and headed out. The walk there is mostly through dense forest, following what passes for a trail, but is really just a slightly less overgrown path through the bush. About halfway there, I started noticing something odd. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but then it hit me. It was the silence. If you've spent time in the northern bush, you know it's never truly silent. There's always something. Birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, insects buzzing, the whisper of wind in the trees. But that day, nothing. Complete stillness. I mentioned it to my girlfriend and she nodded, clearly having noticed it too. "Feels weird today," she said simply. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. Then came the sensation, the one that makes the tiny hairs on your arms stand up and your skin prickle with goosebumps. The feeling of being watched. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know the difference between normal awareness of your surroundings and that distinct primitive alarm bell that rings in your head when something is focusing its attention on you. This was definitely the latter. I glanced at my girlfriend and she was rubbing the back of her neck. Later she told me she'd felt the same thing, that tingling sensation at the base of her skull. We didn't talk about it then though. I think we both hoped that ignoring it would make it go away. When we reached the beach, the feeling subsided somewhat. The beach itself is maybe half a mile long, a crescent of pale sand backed by rocky outcrops and thick forest. The lake stretches out wide and deep, its surface reflecting the blue sky. It's usually a place that brings immediate peace, but that day there was an edge to the tranquility, like the calm before a storm. We set up our blanket on the sand, trying to recapture the carefree mood we'd started the day with. For a little while it worked. We ate our sandwiches, talked about community gossip, skipped stones across the water. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, not quite setting, but definitely on its way down, casting long shadows across the sand. That's when my girlfriend suddenly went still, her hand gripping my forearm so tight it almost hurt. Her eyes were fixed on a point behind me, toward the tree line at the north end of the beach. I turned, following her gaze, and at first saw nothing but shadows among the trees. Then it moved, I can't accurately describe the size of this thing because my mind keeps trying to downplay it, to make it more reasonable. But if I'm being honest, it was huge, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was standing upright on 2 legs at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the trees, but unmistakably there. It had a massive, broad frame covered in what looked like dark grey hair or fur. Here's where it gets difficult to explain. I've seen bears my whole life. I know what a bear looks like, even standing on its hind legs. This was not a bear. The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too human-like in its posture, but definitely not human. The creature wasn't moving much, just standing there, watching us, and yet, despite the distance between us, maybe 100 yards, the sense of focused attention was overwhelming. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I'd never felt fear like that before. Not the adrenaline spike of a startling moment, but something deeper and more primal. It was like my body recognized a danger that my mind couldn't fully comprehend. My girlfriend must have felt the same because we didn't speak, didn't point, didn't do any of the things you might expect. We just started packing up our things with quick, jerky movements, never taking our eyes off that spot in the trees. The creature still hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching. That's what was so unnerving. The stillness, the patience, like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. We left everything that wasn't essential. The remains of our food, one of our water bottles, none of it mattered. We just needed to leave. We backed away slowly at first, not wanting to trigger any kind of chase response. Once we were a good distance away, we turned and walked quickly toward the path home, fighting the urge to run blindly into the forest. The moment we entered the trees, that sensation of being watched intensified. The silence was still there, pressing against our ears. We moved as fast as we could without running, following the path back toward our community. I kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see that massive shape emerging from the trees, but there was nothing visible. Nothing visible doesn't mean nothing there, though. That feeling of being followed stayed with us for a long time, much longer than it should have. By my estimate, we were almost 2 miles closer to our community before the sensation finally began to fade and the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. A bird call here, the scurrying of a small animal there. We didn't speak much on the way back. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, and we both knew it defied easy explanation. When we finally reached the edge of our community, my girlfriend turned to me and said simply, "We don't tell anyone about this." I nodded in agreement, but that night, neither of us could sleep. We kept going over it, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Could it have been a bear? The lighting playing tricks, but we both knew it wasn't. The way it stood, the way it watched us, the unnatural silence that preceded its appearance, none of it fit with normal explanations. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, we made a decision that in retrospect seems crazy. We decided to go back. It was daylight, we reasoned. Whatever it was would surely be gone. And maybe, in the clear light of day, we'd find tracks or some other evidence that would help us make sense of what we'd seen. So we went back, this time bringing my cousin's dog with us, a big German Shepherd mix that's usually fearless. The dog was happy and energetic as we started out, but as we got closer to the beach, his behavior changed. He started walking closer to us, his tail down, occasionally whining softly. By the time we reached the spot where we'd felt the change in the atmosphere the day before, the dog was practically pressed against my leg, his ears flattened. The forest was quieter than normal, though not as completely silent as it had been before. We made it to the beach and headed straight for the area where we'd seen the figure. The sand and soil there should have shown tracks if anything large had been standing there, but we found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all. But the feeling was back. Not as intense as before, but unmistakable, that sense of being observed by something just out of sight. The dog felt it too. He kept looking toward the trees, growling low in his throat, the fur along his spine standing up. We didn't stay long. 20 minutes of searching without finding anything, all while fighting that growing sense of unease, was enough. We left, and the relief we felt as we got farther from that place was palpable. Since then, we've talked about it more, trying to process what happened. We've heard stories, of course. Every First Nations community has legends of strange creatures in the wilderness. But those were just stories to me before. Now I'm not so sure. We haven't told many people. Those we have mentioned it to have had mixed reactions, some curious, some dismissive, a few understanding in a way that makes me think they might have had their own unexplainable experiences. But we've refused to talk to any outsiders about it. There have been a couple of researchers who've come through our community, people studying wildlife or documenting indigenous knowledge, and they always seem especially interested in stories about large, unidentified creatures. We've avoided them. It's been 6 months, and we haven't gone back to that beach after dark. During the day, occasionally with a group of people, yes, but never alone, never as the sun is setting. That grey shape standing in the trees has taken something from us, a sense of security in places that have always been like home. I still don't know what we saw that day. I'm not sure I want to know, but I am sure of one thing. Something was watching us from those trees, something that didn't belong, something that understood enough to stay hidden, to leave no trace. And sometimes when the house is quiet at night, I find myself straining to hear if the normal sounds of the world outside have suddenly gone silent. Story 5. I've never shared this story before, not in full detail at least. For years I've kept it mostly to myself because honestly, who would believe it? But I need to get it off my chest, and I know if there's anywhere people might understand, it's here. I grew up in a small town in northern Michigan, about 20 minutes from Lake Huron. One of those places where everybody knows everybody, and there's not much for teenagers to do except hang out at the one pizza place or work part-time jobs. I started babysitting when I was 14 to earn some extra cash. And by 16, I had become the go-to sitter for most families in our area. I was responsible, good with kids, and parents trusted me. This happened 5 years ago when I was 17. I was watching Ethan, an 8-year-old boy I'd been sitting for almost 2 years. He was usually a super easy kid, well-behaved, went to bed without a fuss, and was content reading books or playing board games. His parents both worked at the hospital and sometimes had overnight shifts, which meant I'd occasionally stay over. It was early October, and I'd been watching Ethan about twice a week while his mum worked extra shifts. The first sign something was off came during one of those overnight stays. I'd tucked him in around 8:30, then settled in the living room to do homework. Around 10, I heard him calling me from upstairs. When I got to his room, he was sitting up in bed, clutching his blanket tightly. "I can't sleep," he whispered. "I keep seeing something at my window." His bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and there wasn't a tree close enough for anyone to climb. I assured him it was probably just shadows from the branches moving in the wind. I closed his curtains tightly and sat with him until he fell back asleep. I didn't think much of it. Kids get scared, it happens. But the next morning over breakfast, he brought it up again. "The thing at my window wasn't a shadow," he said quietly, pushing his cereal around. "It had eyes." I remember feeling a chill then, but I brushed it off. His house backed up to a wooded area, so I figured maybe he'd seen an owl or a raccoon on a nearby branch, and his imagination had done the rest. Fast forward about 2 weeks. It was a Friday evening, unusually warm for mid-October, so Ethan and I decided to hang out in the gazebo in their backyard. His parents had built it the previous summer, just a simple structure with a wooden frame, wire mesh screens and a metal roof. We brought snacks, a couple books, and a lantern since the sun was starting to set. We'd been out there maybe an hour. The sky had turned that deep purple-blue color of early evening, and I just turned on the lantern. Ethan was sitting across from me, reading a book about dinosaurs, when I noticed him go completely still, his eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder, and the color drained from his face. I thought maybe he'd seen a deer. They were common in the area. But the look on his face wasn't excitement. It was pure terror. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. I still don't know where it came from. One second there was nothing, and the next it was just there, standing at the edge of the woods, about 30 feet from the gazebo. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. The initial thing I noticed were its eyes. They were amber-colored and reflected the lantern light, but they weren't animal eyes. They were almost human-like, but wild, and filled with an intelligence that made my stomach drop. It was like looking at something that understood exactly what it was seeing and was calculating its next move. It had an elongated face, somewhere between a wolf and something else I couldn't identify. Tall, pointed ears stood straight up from its head. Its snout was long, and even from that distance, I could see teeth that seemed too large for its mouth. It stood on two legs, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that was muscular but lean. Dark fur covered most of it, but in the fading light I couldn't tell if it was black or dark brown. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other, me, Ethan, and this thing. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of cement. Part of me was trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a bear standing on its hind legs, but no bear has a face like that. No bear looks at you with that kind of awareness. The spell broke when the creature took a step forward. Its movement was fluid, almost graceful, despite its massive size. That's when Ethan screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure fear that snapped me back to reality. I looked around the gazebo frantically. We were sitting in what basically amounted to a glorified screened porch. The wooden posts were maybe 2 inches thick, and the wire mesh wouldn't stop anything. I could clearly see the creature's claws now as it moved, long curved things that could rip through the screen like tissue paper. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached across and grabbed Ethan, pulling him onto my lap. He was trembling violently, and I could feel his tears soaking into my shirt. My eyes darted around for anything I could use as a weapon. All I found was a small rock that they used to hold the gazebo door closed when it was windy. I grabbed it, though I knew it would do nothing against what was outside. The creature took another step closer, and I could see its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. It was deciding, I think, deciding if we were worth the effort. And then, I swear this still feels like divine intervention, a pair of deer wandered out from the tree line, about 50 yards to our right. The creature's head snapped in their direction. There was no hesitation. In a movement so fast I could barely track it, it dropped to all fours and lunged toward the deer. The closest deer didn't even have time to react. The creature was on it in seconds, jaws clamping around its throat. The sound, God, the sound was something between a crack and a wet tearing noise that I still hear in my nightmares. I didn't wait to see more. I scooped Ethan up and ran for the house. He was sobbing against my shoulder, and I was gasping for breath, adrenaline making my legs feel like rubber. Behind us, I heard a deep, guttural roar that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Not a wolf, not a bear. Something else entirely. We made it to the back door, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran through the house locking every door and window. I closed all the blinds and curtains too, before finally collapsing on the kitchen floor with Ethan still clinging to me. I called the police with trembling hands. The dispatcher must have thought I was crazy because I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I just kept saying there was a dangerous animal in the backyard that had killed a deer, and that we were afraid it might try to get into the house. To their credit, they sent officers quickly. By the time they arrived, Ethan had cried himself into exhaustion, and I'd moved us to the living room, as far from windows as possible. I remember the officers' faces when they came back from checking the backyard. They looked confused and disturbed. They found what was left of the deer, but according to them, it didn't make sense. The deer had been efficiently dismembered and partially eaten, in a way that didn't match any predator they were familiar with. One officer mentioned that whatever did it would have needed incredible strength and sharp teeth to cause that kind of damage so quickly. They searched the area but found no trace of the creature itself. No footprints, no fur, nothing. They suggested it might have been a wolf or possibly a cougar, though cougars weren't supposed to be in our area. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a wolf or a cougar. It walked on two legs. It had a face that was almost human. It had eyes that understood. Ethan's parents came home early when the police called them. I remember trying to explain what happened without sounding completely insane. I said we'd seen a large animal, possibly a wolf, that had attacked a deer. I didn't mention the human-like qualities or the way it had stood upright. I couldn't bring myself to say those things out loud to adults who would never believe me. I never babysat at their house again. Ethan's mom called me a few days later to check in, and she mentioned that Ethan was having nightmares about the wolf man and refused to go near the backyard. She said they were taking him to talk to someone, and I felt terrible for him. He had seen exactly what I had seen, but no one would ever believe either of us. After that, I still babysat for other families, but I developed strict rules. No going outside after dark. No sitting near windows with the curtains open. If we were playing in a yard during the day, I kept the kids close and constantly scanned the tree line. I did some research in the weeks that followed. I found stories about something called a dogman, a creature from Michigan folklore that's described almost exactly like what we saw. Most people treat these stories like campfire tales, but there are online forums full of people who claim to have seen similar things, people who sound rational and level-headed, but who have encountered something they can't explain. I believe what Ethan and I saw that night was a dogman. I believe it could have killed us both in seconds if it had chosen to. Whether it was distracted by the deer or simply decided we weren't worth the trouble, I'll never know. But I think about how thin those gazebo walls were, how easily it could have gotten to us, and I still break out in a cold sweat. 5 years have passed, and I've moved away from that town for college. But I still don't go hiking alone. I still get nervous when I hear something moving in the bushes at night. And I still wake up sometimes from dreams where I'm back in that gazebo, but the deer never come, and those intelligent amber eyes are getting closer and closer. Story 6. I've been putting off writing this for years. Even now, I feel my hands getting clammy just thinking about it. But I need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This happened in September of 2006. I was going through a rough patch in my life, had just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years, and needed to clear my head. I've always found hiking therapeutic, so I decided to spend a day exploring the trails around Mount St. Helens. I'd hiked there a few times before, nothing too challenging, just enough to work up a sweat and enjoy some solitude. That morning started out perfect. The weather was crisp but not too cold, with that early fall feeling in the air. I packed light, just water, some trail mix, a sandwich, and my small digital camera. I wore my usual hiking gear, sturdy boots, cargo pants and layers because the temperature can change quickly up there. I also brought my flashlight, though I wasn't planning to stay out past dark. I hit the trail around 11 in the morning. It was peaceful, you know. Just the sounds of birds, the occasional rustle in the underbrush from squirrels or whatever, and the crunch of my boots on the path. I stopped a few times to take pictures of the landscape. The forest there is beautiful. Tall pines, moss-covered rocks, that earthy smell of decomposing leaves. I didn't see many other hikers that day, just a couple heading back to the trailhead when I was about an hour in. I remember checking my watch around 4 in the afternoon and thinking I should probably turn back. But I was feeling good, and there was this viewpoint I wanted to reach that was supposedly only another mile or so ahead. Big mistake. I finally got to the viewpoint around 5:30, took some photos, ate the last of my trail mix and started heading back. That's when I realized I'd screwed up. The days were getting shorter and the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. I knew I had at least 2 hours of hiking ahead of me, and it would be dark well before I made it back to my car. No big deal, I thought. I had my flashlight, and I knew the trail well enough, so I picked up my pace, trying to cover as much ground as possible while there was still some light. By 6:30, the forest was getting really dark. I switched on my flashlight, and that's when things started to feel off. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? That's what I felt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones like someone wearing boots or, I don't know. They sounded different from mine. Deeper somehow, more deliberate. They were coming from behind me on the trail. I stopped walking and turned around, sweeping my flashlight beam across the path. Nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of my light. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds listening. Dead silence, so I turned and started walking again. The footsteps resumed. Same pace as mine, same rhythm, just always about 20 feet behind me. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped too. Turned around, shined my light. Nothing. At this point, I was getting freaked out, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an echo. Maybe the sound was bouncing off the trees or something. I know that doesn't make sense, but I was trying to stay calm. I picked up my pace, walking faster. The footsteps behind me matched my speed perfectly, always maintaining that same distance, never getting closer, never falling behind. Then I noticed the smell. God, that smell. It was like sweat, but not human sweat, more animal-like, mixed with something rotten, like decaying meat. And there was this underlying scent of wet fur or hair. It was so strong I could almost taste it. I covered my nose with my shirt and started walking even faster, almost jogging now. The footsteps kept pace behind me, and then I heard breathing, deep, heavy breathing, like something large was exerting itself. But it wasn't labored breathing. It was controlled, purposeful, like it could go much faster if it wanted to. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I was scared to turn around again, but I did anyway, swinging my flashlight wildly behind me, still nothing visible on the trail. But this time, I caught a flash of movement off to my right, between the trees. Whatever it was tall, tall enough to shake branches that had to be at least 8 feet off the ground. But by the time I aimed my flashlight directly at it, there was nothing there. This happened a few more times over the next 20 minutes or so. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision, swing my light toward it, and it would vanish, like it was playing some sick game with me, always staying just out of sight. The worst part was that I couldn't run. The trail was too uneven, too rocky in places, and with just my flashlight, I was afraid I'd trip and hurt myself. Then I'd be completely at the mercy of whatever this thing was. About an hour into this nightmare, I came to a small clearing where the trail widened a bit. I stopped, partly because I needed to catch my breath, and partly because I thought maybe if I confronted it, it would leave me alone. That was when I felt it. The ground literally trembled beneath my feet from the impact of a single heavy step. Just one. Like whatever was following me had decided to make its presence known. It was close, maybe 10 feet away now. I could feel its presence behind me, almost like a physical weight pressing against my back. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then I bolted. Screw the uneven trail. Screw potentially twisting an ankle. I ran like I've never run before. I could hear it moving through the forest alongside me now, not on the trail anymore, but crashing through the underbrush to my right, breaking branches, making this weird huffing sound that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. The smell got stronger too, so strong it made my eyes water. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever, My lungs were burning, my legs were on fire, but pure adrenaline kept me going. The whole time, it kept pace with me, always just out of sight. Finally, I saw the lights of the parking area through the trees. The trailhead was just ahead. I was sobbing with relief at this point, gasping for breath, but I didn't slow down. Just as I reached the edge of the forest, about 50 yards from my car, I stopped and turned around. I don't know why I did it. Some primal need to see what had been stalking me, I guess. That's when I saw them. Two faint points of light glowing between the trees. Eyes. They were reflecting the beam of my flashlight, the way animal eyes do at night, but these weren't low to the ground like a coyote or a deer. They were high up, easily 7 or 8 feet off the ground, and they were fixed right on me. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I could hear its breathing, smell its stench. It was just standing there, watching me from the darkness. Then I backed away slowly toward my car, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I never turned my back on those eyes. When I reached my car, I unlocked it, yanked the door open, and practically fell inside. I locked the doors immediately, started the engine, and flooded the area with my headlights. The eyes were gone. Whatever it was had retreated deeper into the forest. I peeled out of that parking lot like a maniac, and I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway. I kept checking my rearview mirror the whole drive home, convinced I was going to see those eyes again. It's been years since this happened, but I still get nightmares about it. I've tried researching what it might have been. A bear? No way. Bears don't stalk people like that, and they don't stand that tall. Mountain lion? They're stealthy, but again, not that big. The only thing that comes close to matching what I experienced is, well, you know, that creature people claim to see in the Pacific Northwest. But I've always been skeptical about that stuff. At least I was, until that night. I haven't gone hiking alone since then, and never, ever after dark. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps and smell that awful stench. And I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, waiting for some other lone hiker to come along. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I just know that whatever was following me on that trail wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'm familiar with. And the way it seemed to be playing with me, keeping pace, letting me know it was there but staying just out of sight, that was the most terrifying part. Like it was intelligent, like it was enjoying my fear. I don't have any proof. No photos, no footprints, nothing. Just my story and the nightmares that still wake me up in a cold sweat. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Most people would think I'm crazy or that I just spooked myself in the dark. But I know what I experienced was real. Those eyes in the darkness were real. And sometimes, when I'm driving near forested areas at dusk, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes watching me again. Story 7. I've kept this story to myself for nearly 2 decades, only telling a few trusted colleagues and my ex-wife. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake. I spent 15 years as a New York State trooper, and I've seen things most people never will. Fatal accidents, crime scenes, the worst of humanity. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened that fall night in 2004. It was mid-October in the Adirondacks. The leaf-peeping tourists had mostly gone home, and the mountains had that eerie quiet they get before winter sets in. I was on backcountry patrol, one of those assignments nobody wants. Miles of empty forest roads with spotty radio coverage and no backup nearby. My supervisor had me checking secondary roads about 20 miles from the nearest town, making sure no hunters were setting up camp illegally before season opened. The sun had set about an hour earlier. I remember checking my watch around 6:30 p.m., thinking I'd finish my route and grab dinner at that diner near the station. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and a light fog was forming in patches along the road. I had my cruiser's heater running full blast and was sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos. I was doing about 30 miles per hour along this narrow, winding road, barely more than a fire access trail, really. The kind of place where you might see a deer or maybe a bear if you're unlucky, but definitely not other people. My headlights were cutting through patchy fog, and I was just thinking about turning around when it happened. The impact was so sudden and violent, I thought I'd hit something. There was this deafening crash as something massive slammed onto the hood of my cruiser. The front end dipped dramatically, and I instinctively stomped the brake pedal. My coffee went flying, splashing across the dashboard and my uniform. For a few seconds, I just sat there, heart pounding, trying to process what had happened. My first thought was a tree had fallen. We'd had some wind earlier in the week. I grabbed my maglite from the passenger seat and cautiously opened my door, drawing my service weapon as I stepped out. What I saw on my hood wasn't a branch or even a small tree. It was a massive log, easily 6 feet long and thick as my thigh. The hood was crushed inward from the impact. This wasn't something that had fallen naturally. It would have taken at least 3 strong men to lift and throw it. And the way it was positioned, it had been deliberately placed there. That's when the first real wave of fear hit me, 15 years on the force, and my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I swept my flashlight across the tree line on both sides of the road, keeping my back to the cruiser. The beam didn't penetrate more than 20 feet into the dense forest. Then I noticed the silence. I mean complete, absolute silence. No insects, no wind in the trees, no distant owls or night birds. Nothing. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows that kind of silence is unnatural. It's like the forest itself is holding its breath. I keyed my radio, but all I got was static. We always had dead zones in those mountains, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I was reaching back through the window to try the car radio instead when I felt it. That sensation of being watched that cuts through every other thought. I swung my flashlight toward the right side of the road, about 30 yards ahead, where the trees thinned slightly. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The figure stepped forward into the edge of my headlights, and I remember thinking absurdly that someone was playing a prank. Some hunter in a costume or something, but within seconds I knew this was no costume, no human. It stood well over 7 feet tall, with a frame so massive it seemed impossible. The shoulders were incredibly broad, easily twice the width of a large man. What struck me most were its proportions, all wrong for a human. The arms hung abnormally long, nearly to its knees, ending in hands that looked powerful enough to crush stone. Dark hair covered its entire body, not fur exactly, but coarse hair ranging from dark brown to black. The hair on its head continued down its back, but I could clearly see its face. That face, I still see it in nightmares. A wide, flat nose sat above thin lips pulled back slightly to reveal teeth. The brow ridge was heavy and prominent, shadowing deep-set eyes that caught my headlights and reflected back with a reddish glow. Its head wasn't rounded like ours, but slightly conical. For maybe 5 seconds, we just stared at each other. I had my weapon half raised, but couldn't make myself complete the motion. I've drawn down on armed suspects before without hesitation, but something about this creature paralyzed me with a fear I'd never experienced. Then it made a sound I'll never forget, a roar so deep and powerful, I felt it vibrate through my chest cavity. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. It had layers to it, almost like multiple voices. Before I could react, it moved. The speed was shocking. One moment it was standing at the edge of the trees, the next it was charging directly at me. I've seen bears run, and they can be fast, but this thing covered 30 yards in what felt like 2 seconds. I stumbled backward, tripping against the cruiser's doorframe as the creature slammed into the front of my vehicle. The entire cruiser rocked violently, metal groaning as it absorbed the impact. I scrambled desperately into the driver's seat, dropping my flashlight in the process. The creature began pounding on the hood with what sounded like both fists, creating deep dents in the metal with each impact. The entire vehicle shook with each blow. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Then it moved to my side of the vehicle. I'll never forget looking up and seeing its face just inches from mine through the driver's window. Those eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying intelligence. It wasn't just angry. It was deliberately trying to get to me. It slammed an open hand against my windshield with such force that the safety glass immediately spider-webbed into 1,000 cracks. Then it struck the driver's side fender, caving in the metal like it was made of cardboard. I finally got the engine started, and the sound seemed to enrage it further. It pounded harder on the roof, leaving deep dents in the reinforced metal. I threw the cruiser in reverse and floored the accelerator, tires spinning on the loose gravel. As I began moving, it struck the side of the vehicle one final time, hitting the rear quarter panel with a hollow thud that echoed inside the cabin. I reversed about 50 yards before spinning the wheel and shifting into drive. I floored it again, swerving around the logs still lying in the road. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway 20 minutes later. When I finally made it back to the station, my sergeant took one look at me and thought I'd been in an accident. My uniform was soaked with sweat and spilled coffee, and apparently I was pale as a ghost. The cruiser told the rest of the story. Dash, crushed hood, shattered windshield, massive dents in the roof and sides that clearly showed the impression of something like a giant hand. I had to file a report, of course. I told my sergeant everything exactly as it happened. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to wait while he called the captain. 2 hours later, I was sitting with both of them reviewing my statement. The official report ended up stating the vehicle had been struck by falling timber in a remote area. My sergeant took me aside afterward and told me, "For your own good, stick to the story. Nobody needs to know what you really saw out there." Over the next few weeks, I heard rumors that 2 Forestry Service employees had quit after a similar encounter about 15 miles from where mine occurred. I tried to follow up, but was told to drop it. 6 months later, I requested a transfer to a different county. It's been almost 19 years, and I've never been back to that section of the Adirondacks. I left the force 10 years ago after my divorce. My ex-wife said I was never the same after that night, and she's right. I don't camp anymore, I don't hike. I keep my blinds closed at night. I've dealt with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, armed standoffs, situations where my life was legitimately on the line. None of that comes close to the absolute terror I felt when that thing hit my car. The worst part wasn't the physical threat, though that was real enough. It was the look in its eyes, the clear intelligence there, the deliberate nature of the attack. It knew exactly what it was doing. People ask me now if I believe in Bigfoot, and I just changed the subject. What I encountered wasn't some shy, elusive forest creature that accidentally crossed paths with a human. This was something that deliberately attacked a police vehicle, something strong enough to nearly tear it apart, something that wanted me to know it was there. I don't know what to call what I saw that night. I just know that I'm still afraid of it, all these years later. And I still check my rearview mirror when I drive on dark roads. Story 8, I've never talked about this much. Even now, 50+ years later, I still get this weird feeling in my gut when I think about it. Like something inside me knows I witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be seen. But I need to get this out, so here goes. Spring of 1966. I was young, 20 years old, and full of that weird mix of confidence and fear you get when you're about to ship out to war. I was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, with the 4th Infantry Division. We all knew we were heading to Vietnam soon. The whole base had this strange energy, guys trying to act tough while secretly wondering if they'd make it back home. Our unit was sent to the Olympic National Forest for field operations. If you've never been there, it's this massive wilderness in north-central Washington. Dense pine forests that seem to go on forever, steep hills that make your calves burn, and river valleys cutting through it all. Beautiful country, but isolated as hell. Our commanding officers were big on combat readiness and all that, so they organized this security exercise. They needed volunteers to act as the enemy force, basically play hide and seek in the woods at night. Me and 7 other guys raised our hands. I thought it would be fun, maybe even a little adventurous before the real danger began in Vietnam. The exercise was scheduled to start after midnight. Our job was to infiltrate the company's defensive perimeter without getting caught. If we managed that, we'd win points for our squad. Simple enough, right? That day was spent setting up camp and getting briefed. I remember the weather was typical Pacific Northwest, misty, damp, with that bone-chilling cold that seeps into your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. We were up in high country, and the fog rolled in thick by evening, the kind that muffles sounds and makes the forest feel like it's closing in around you. After chow, we got our instructions. We'd be given a 2-hour head start to position ourselves around the perimeter. Then, at midnight, the defending troops would set up their security posts and begin active patrols. Our job was to slip through their lines without being detected. Around 10 p.m., our small group moved out. We had no real weapons, just wooden mock rifles. We split up immediately. Better odds if we all took different approaches. I remember hiking about a mile through the thick forest, using my compass to make sure I was heading in the right direction. The forest at night is a different world. Every shadow looks like a person. Every sound makes you freeze. I found what I thought was a perfect spot, a ridge overlooking the main camp area about half a mile out. I could see their campfires through the trees, just tiny orange dots in the distance. I settled in to wait. Midnight came, and I could hear the distant sounds of the exercise starting, shouted commands, the occasional flare lighting up the sky. I waited about 20 minutes, then started making my way down toward their perimeter. I was doing pretty well until I nearly walked straight into a 2-man patrol. I dove behind some bushes just in time, but they must have heard something because they came investigating. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it. They passed within 10 feet of me, sweeping their flashlights back and forth. One guy said, "I swear I heard something over here." I held my breath until my lungs burned. Finally, they moved on, but I knew they'd be back. I decided to change position, moving laterally along the hillside before continuing toward the camp. That's when I heard a whistle blast, the signal that someone from our team had been captured. Then another whistle a few minutes later. They were picking us off one by one. The whole forest erupted with activity. Flares went up, patrols started moving in grid patterns, and I realized they were doing a really thorough job. I wasn't going to complete my mission by sneaking through. I needed to hide and wait them out. I found this massive fallen pine tree with a space underneath where the root system had partially torn up from the ground. I squeezed into this dark hollow and pulled some branches around me. It was tight, uncomfortable, and smelled like wet earth and rot. But it was a good hiding spot. Time moves differently when you're hiding in the dark, alone, in the woods. Every minute felt like 10. I could hear patrols passing nearby, flashlight beams occasionally sweeping over my hiding spot. I stayed absolutely still. The worst part was the cold and damp. My pants were soaked through from the wet ground, and I was shivering uncontrollably at times. I must have been in that spot for over an hour. Eventually, the sounds of the exercise seemed to be moving away from my position. I figured they'd concluded I wasn't in this sector and moved on to search elsewhere. Around 3 a.m., maybe 3:30, it was hard to be sure, I decided to try making my way back toward our company area. The exercise would be wrapping up soon anyway. I crawled out from under that log, my joints stiff from cold and inactivity. I was disoriented at first, but I knew there was a logging road about 300 yards east that would lead me back to camp. I started making my way there, moving as quietly as possible. The fog had thickened and visibility was poor, maybe 15, 20 feet at most. The moon was just a faint glow behind the cloud cover. I reached the logging road and paused, listening. No sounds of patrols nearby. I figured I'd follow the road back. It was longer than cutting through the woods, but less chance of getting lost. That's when it happened. I'd only gone about 50 yards down the road when I spotted a silhouette moving on the hillside to my right. It was coming down toward the road, maybe 70 yards ahead of me. My first thought was that it was one of the other guys from my team, or maybe a patrol. The figure was large. I mean, really large. But in the fog and darkness, distances and sizes get distorted. I did what any soldier would do. I called out the standard challenge. Halt! Who goes there? What happened next? I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Instead of a voice responding with the countersign, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, rumbling growl. Not a human sound at all, but not quite like any animal I'd heard before either. It was deep, threatening, and it echoed slightly in the fog. The silhouette stopped moving. I could tell it had turned toward me. Even through the fog, I could make out that it was massive, way too big to be a man. My mind immediately went to bear, because what else could it be? But something wasn't right. The shape was all wrong. It was still standing upright. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, we just stood there. Me, frozen in place, this thing, watching me from the hillside. Then it took a step forward, still upright, still making that low rumbling sound. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. My body just took over. 1 second I was standing there. The next I was sprinting down that logging road faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The sound of my boots on the gravel seemed impossibly loud. I don't know if it followed me. I was too scared to turn around. I just ran until my lungs were burning and my legs were ready to give out. The company campfire appeared ahead through the trees, the main assembly area where the exercise would conclude. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, wild-eyed. Several officers were there, along with some of the guys who'd been captured earlier. They all turned and stared at me like I was crazy. I must have looked it, covered in mud, twigs in my hair, face probably white as a sheet. One of the lieutenants asked what the hell was wrong with me. When I caught my breath enough to speak, I told them I'd seen a bear on the logging road. It seemed like the only explanation that made sense, the only thing they'd believe. And maybe that's what I was trying to convince myself it was too. They laughed it off, told me bears were common in the area, but generally avoided humans. Someone handed me a cup of coffee, and the conversation moved on to who had won the exercise. No one took my bear sighting seriously. Why would they? We were soldiers preparing for war. A bear in the woods was nothing to get worked up about. But I knew what I saw wasn't normal. A bear on that steep hillside would have dropped to all fours for stability. This thing stayed upright the whole time. Its shape was wrong too. The shoulders too wide, the head seemingly attached directly to those shoulders without much of a neck. I didn't push the issue. I drank my coffee, tried to stop shaking, and joined in with the post-exercise banter. Within a week we were preparing to ship out to Vietnam, and there were more immediate fears to worry about than whatever I'd encountered in those woods. I served my tour in Vietnam, a whole other set of nightmares, and came home in 1967. I was watching TV one night when they showed this footage that had just come out. The Patterson film, they called it. Two guys had filmed something in Northern California, a large, upright, hairy figure walking across a dry riverbed. The moment I saw that broad-shouldered silhouette on the screen, walking with that distinctive gait, I felt like someone had dumped ice water down my back. It was the same shape, the same proportions as what I'd seen on that logging road in Olympic National Forest. I've gone back and forth over the years about what I really encountered that night. Sometimes I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, and my mind played tricks on me because I was tired, cold, and on edge from the exercise. But deep down, I know better. I never told anyone in my unit what I really thought I saw. What was I gonna say? Hey guys, I think I ran into Bigfoot during our training exercise. They'd have laughed me out of the barracks, and after Vietnam, well, nobody wanted to hear about monsters in the woods when we'd all seen the monsters men can become. So I kept it to myself all these years. Sometimes I wonder how many other people have seen something similar but stayed quiet for the same reasons I did. How many encounters in those vast forests go unreported because who would believe you? All I know is that whatever growled at me that foggy spring night in 1966 was not a bear, not a man, and not something I can explain away, even after all these years. And whenever I see documentaries about the Patterson film or hear stories about Bigfoot, I get that same cold feeling in the pit of my stomach, because I know they're out there. I just wish I didn't. Story 9. I've been hesitating to share this for years, not because I'm afraid people won't believe me. I honestly don't care about that anymore, but because even after all this time, thinking about it still makes my hands shake. This happened back in '74 in Cape Coral, Florida. I was 32 then, living in a modest house near the canal system. This was before Cape Coral got built up like it is now. Back then, there were still plenty of empty lots and wild spaces between the neighborhoods. It started with little things, strange noises outside my windows at night. Nothing specific at first, just rustling sounds that seemed too deliberate to be raccoons or possums. My German shepherd Rex would perk his ears up and stare at the walls, occasionally letting out low growls that made the hair on my arms stand up. Rex wasn't the kind of dog to get spooked easily. He was 100 pounds of muscle and intelligence, trained to alert, but not to bark unnecessarily. When he started acting nervous, I paid attention. The first week, I chalked it up to the neighbors getting a new pet, or maybe some wildlife that had wandered in from the undeveloped areas. By the second week, I started to worry. Rex wouldn't settle at night. He'd pace back and forth between the bedroom and the living room windows, his nails clicking on the tile floors. Sometimes he'd freeze, staring at a particular window, the fur on his back raising slightly. One night during that second week, I got up to use the bathroom around 2 in the morning and found Rex standing rigid at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. He wasn't growling, which was somehow worse. He was just watching. When I touched his back, he nearly jumped out of his skin. That wasn't my confident, steady dog. That was an animal experiencing true fear. By the third week, I was sleeping poorly and keeping my .38 revolver closer than usual. I'd owned it for years, a simple 6-shot Smith & Wesson that I kept for protection. Living alone, especially back then as a single guy in a developing area, it just made sense. I'd never had to use it for anything more than target practice, but having it nearby gave me some comfort as the nighttime disturbances continued. Then came that night. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I'd just watched Kojak and gone to bed around 11. The air conditioner was running. Florida in summer, you know how it is. But even with that steady background noise, I woke up suddenly at what my bedside clock showed was 1:58 in the morning. Rex was standing beside the bed, making a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something in between. His whole body was trembling. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, reaching for the lamp. Before I could turn it on, Rex bolted from the room. I heard his nails scrambling on the tile as he ran to the back door, where he started scratching frantically. This wasn't his "I need to go out" behavior. This was panic. I grabbed my revolver from the nightstand drawer and followed him. The house was dark except for the dim blue light from the microwave clock in the kitchen. Rex was throwing himself against the sliding glass door now, desperate to get outside, which made no sense given how fearful he'd been of the yard recently. Okay, I said, unlocking the door. But stay close. The instant I slid the door open, Rex squeezed through the gap and disappeared into the darkness. I called after him in a harsh whisper, not wanting to make too much noise in the middle of the night. From the patio, I could hear him scrambling under something. Following the sound, I realized he'd run straight to the garage and was trying to hide under my car. My dog, my brave, protective German Shepherd, was cowering beneath a Chevy Impala like a frightened puppy. The night was humid and still, that heavy Florida air that feels like breathing through a warm, wet towel. The quarter moon provided just enough light to see the outlines of my yard, the fence, the shed in the corner. Something felt wrong, not just because of Rex's behavior, but because of the complete absence of sound. No cicadas, no frogs, nothing. I stepped further into the yard, my bare feet silent on the grass. The revolver felt reassuringly solid in my right hand. I scanned the perimeter, looking for whatever had spooked Rex. That's when I noticed the air conditioner unit on the side of the house was silent. It had been running when I went to bed, but now it was completely still. In Florida summer heat, that's a serious problem. I moved toward it, thinking maybe there was a power outage, though the house lights had been working fine. As I rounded the corner of the house, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing there, not 15 feet away from me, was something I still struggled to describe accurately. It was tall, ridiculously tall. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing towered over me by at least 3 feet. It was broad too, with shoulders twice the width of mine, covered in what looked like grayish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, but hair, somewhat like a human's but longer and coarser. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't an animal face at all. It was almost human-like, but flatter, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, lipless mouth. In the dim moonlight, I could make out its eyes, deep-set and reflecting what little light there was, like a deer's eyes in headlights, but more aware, intelligent. It was standing next to my air conditioning unit, one massive hand resting on top of it. Later, I would realize it had probably been curious about the vibration and noise. In that moment, though, all I could think was that there was an impossible creature in my yard, and it was looking right at me. My training kicked in. I'd served 4 years in the army before settling in Florida, and I raised the revolver with both hands, aiming center mass. The creature didn't move. It just stared at me, and then it made a sound, a low, rumbling grunt that seemed to come from deep in its chest. I fired once. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. The creature jerked backward, a hand moving to its chest where I'd hit it. I know I hit it. I was a good shot, and at that distance, I couldn't have missed. And then, the strangest thing happened. I tried to fire again, to put the thing down for good, but I couldn't move my finger. It wasn't fear that stopped me. Though I was terrified, it was something else. It felt like my mind was suddenly wrapped in cotton, my thoughts sluggish, and my limbs heavy. I stood there, gun still raised, but completely unable to pull the trigger again. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. It grunted again, louder this time, almost like a person clearing their throat. Then, with a swiftness that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and ran toward the back of my property. I've seen deer move through woods. I've seen big cats at the zoo. Nothing moves like this thing did. Despite its size, it made almost no sound as it ran. It was graceful in a way that defied its bulk, clearing my 6-foot privacy fence in a single bound before disappearing into the undeveloped area beyond. As soon as it was gone, whatever had held me in place lifted. My knees gave out, and I sat down hard on the grass, the revolver still clutched in my shaking hands. I don't know how long I stayed there, trying to process what I'd seen. Eventually, Rex emerged from under the car and came to me. still trembling but no longer panicking. He pressed against my side, both of us seeking comfort in the other's presence. When the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally got to my feet and went to look at the area where the creature had been standing. The grass was flattened in a way that matched where I'd seen it, confirming I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Next to the air conditioner, pressed deep into the soft ground of my flower bed, was a footprint. I've been hunting since I was a kid. I know what bear tracks look like. I know human footprints, dog prints, raccoon tracks, all the usual Florida wildlife. This was something else entirely. It was huge, easily 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. It looked almost human in shape, but no human has feet that size. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever left it was incredibly heavy. I found 2 more prints leading toward the fence, each one perfectly preserved in the damp soil. Then nothing, as if the creature had simply vanished. I went inside and called the local police. When they finally arrived 2 hours later, the deputy looked at the footprints, looked at me, and asked if I'd been drinking. I hadn't been, but I could tell from his expression that he wasn't buying my story. He took some notes, said they'd look into it, and left without even taking photos of the prints. I took my own photos with my Polaroid camera. I still have them somewhere, faded now with age. Not that they'd convince anyone, they just looked like weird depressions in dirt. I know what I saw, though. After the deputy left, I examined my air conditioner. It wasn't broken, just turned off. The switch on the side had been flipped to the off position, something that would require deliberate action. The thought that this creature had enough intelligence to figure out how to silence the machine still unsettles me. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. I kept the revolver close and installed motion sensor lights all around the property. Rex wouldn't go outside alone after dark anymore, not that I blamed him. Gradually, the nighttime disturbances stopped. Whatever it was never came back, at least not that I detected. I've told this story maybe 3 times in the decades since it happened. Most people think I'm making it up or that I dreamed the whole thing. Some suggest it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but that doesn't explain the flat face, the intelligence in its eyes, or those distinctly non-bear-like footprints. The one detail I can never adequately explain, even to myself, is why I couldn't fire that second shot. It wasn't mechanical failure. The gun worked perfectly when I tested it later. It wasn't conscious choice. I fully intended to keep shooting. It was as if something or someone had temporarily taken control of my body, preventing me from causing further harm. Sometimes I wonder if I hit it at all. There was no blood that I could find the next day. Maybe I missed, though I don't see how I could have at that range, or maybe these creatures are tough enough to shrug off a .38 round. The thought isn't comforting. I've since moved away from Cape Coral. Too much development, too many people. I tell myself that's the reason, but deep down, I know I left because I couldn't stand looking out my windows at night anymore, always wondering if something was out there watching me. I don't know what I encountered that night. Bigfoot, skunk ape, some evolutionary offshoot science hasn't classified. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for reasons I'll never understand, it let me live after I shot at it. That's my story, believe it or don't. Like I said, I've reached a point where I don't care much either way. But if you live in an area where the woods come close to your home and your dog starts acting strange at night, pay attention. They sense things we don't, and maybe keep a gun handy. Though, from my experience, I'm not sure how much good it'll do you. Story 10. I've been sitting on this for almost 50 years, too afraid to tell it to anyone but my wife. But I figured with everything going on in the world these days, it's time to finally get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has seen the same thing and can tell me I'm not crazy. It was the summer of '74. I had just gotten back from Vietnam a couple years before and was working security at this new housing development they were building off Highway 441 in Palm Beach. The pay wasn't great, but after what I'd seen overseas, I just wanted something quiet, where I could be alone with my thoughts. The development was about half finished. Lots of wooden frames up, some houses partially completed, but nobody living there yet. Just me, driving around in my Jeep all night, making sure nobody stole construction materials. I usually worked from 8 at night to 4 in the morning, which was fine by me. I'd always been a night owl, and there was something peaceful about having an entire neighborhood to myself. The developers had put in all the streetlights already, but most of the area was still dark. Just empty houses and construction equipment casting weird shadows. That night, July 12th, '74, was hot and sticky, like Florida summers always are. I remember my uniform was sticking to my back, and I had the Jeep windows rolled down, trying to catch any hint of a breeze. I'd been driving my usual route through the development, and it was about 1:30 in the morning when it happened. I was parked near the back of the development where it butted up against this stretch of palmetto scrub and pines. I was just sitting there smoking a cigarette, listening to some quiet music on the radio and watching for any movement. The moon was almost full that night, so visibility wasn't bad. I could see pretty well into the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. That's when I noticed something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the branches moving in the breeze, but there wasn't any breeze that night. It was dead still. I turned the Jeep toward whatever was moving and flipped on the high beams. For a second, I didn't see anything. Then I caught movement again, something big shifting between two pine trees. My first thought was it might be someone trying to steal copper wiring or tools from the site. We'd had problems with that before. I called out, "Security, stop right there." Just like I'd been trained. When there was no response, I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the Jeep and called again, "This is private property. Identify yourself." The figure stepped out from between the trees, and I swear my blood turned to ice water. This wasn't a person, not even close. It was massive. I'd say at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and covered in dark hair or fur. The headlights caught it straight on, and I could see it was hunched over with its head set low on its shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down too far, almost to its knees, and it was broad, way broader than any man I'd ever seen. I'd been through 2 tours in Vietnam as military police. I'd seen combat, seen men die, seen all kinds of horrible things that still give me nightmares, but nothing had ever scared me like seeing that thing step into the light. I stood there frozen for a couple seconds, and it just stared at me. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see eyes reflecting in my headlights, like how a deer's eyes will catch the light, but bigger, much bigger. Then it started walking toward me, not charging, just walking, deliberate, like it wasn't afraid of me at all. That's when I snapped out of it and drew my revolver. We were required to carry while on duty, and I'd never been so grateful for anything in my life. I'd qualified expert with handguns in the army, but my hand was shaking so bad I wasn't sure I could hit anything. "Stop! Don't come any closer!" I shouted, but it kept coming. When it got to about 30 feet away, I could see it better. Its face was flat, kind of pushed in, with a heavy brow ridge. Not like a gorilla exactly, but not human either, something in between. And the smell, oh God, the smell hit me like a physical wave, like rotten eggs and garbage and something else I can't even describe. It burned my nose and made my eyes water. I've smelled dead bodies before in Nam, but this was different, stronger, more, I don't know, wild. It kept coming, and I fired. 6 rounds, right into its chest. I know I hit it. I was close enough that I couldn't miss, and I saw it flinch with each impact, but it didn't go down. It just stopped, looked down at its chest, and then looked back at me. It made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, and clutched at its chest with one massive hand. For a second, we just stared at each other. I had an empty gun, and it was standing there, shot 6 times, looking more pissed off than hurt. That's when I knew I was about to die. But then it turned and ran, not lumbered, not shuffled, ran faster than anything that size should be able to move. It was like watching an Olympic sprinter, except this thing was 7 feet tall and covered in hair. It disappeared back into the trees before I could even think about reloading. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the spot where it vanished. My empty revolver still pointed at nothing. I was shaking all over, sweating bullets, and fighting the urge to throw up from that smell that still hung in the air. Finally, I managed to get back in the Jeep. I reloaded with trembling hands and drove to the construction trailer where we had a phone. I called my supervisor, a guy named Markowitz, and told him I'd had an intruder and discharged my weapon. I didn't tell him what I'd really seen. How could I? He'd think I was crazy or drunk on the job. When he arrived about 20 minutes later with another guard, I took them to the spot. There was nothing there, no blood, no tracks, nothing, just that lingering smell that they both noticed too. Markowitz thought maybe it was a gas leak from somewhere nearby or a dead animal in the brush. "So what did you shoot at?" he kept asking. I told him I'd seen someone large moving in the trees, challenged them. And when they rushed me, I fired. I claimed it was too dark to see clearly who it was, and they must have escaped into the woods. It was the only story I could tell that wouldn't get me fired or committed. Markowitz wasn't happy. Discharging a weapon was serious business. There would be paperwork, maybe even a police report. But the smell and the obvious fear I was still showing convinced him something had happened. The cops came out later that morning. They searched the area but found nothing. No blood trails, no unusual tracks. They took my statement and seemed skeptical, but couldn't prove I hadn't shot at an intruder. I stuck to my story about not being able to identify who it was. I finished my shift in the trailer, still shaking, jumping at every sound. When I got home that morning, I couldn't sleep. I just sat in my living room with all the lights on, staring at the walls. That thing's face burned into my mind. I went back to work the next night. What choice did I have? I needed the job. But I requested a different area to patrol, away from that tree line. For the rest of my time at that development, about 6 more months, I never went near that spot again after dark. I carried extra ammunition. I jumped at shadows. The other guards noticed and gave me shit about it, but I didn't care. I never saw the creature again. But sometimes, on really still nights, I'd catch a whiff of that smell drifting through the development. It was fainter, more distant, but unmistakable. On those nights, I'd stay in the Jeep with the windows up, gun in my lap, counting the minutes until dawn. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened. This was years before the internet, so research meant library books and newspaper archives. I found some articles about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings up north, but nothing about Florida. It wasn't until the 90s that I learned about the skunk ape, Florida's version of Bigfoot, and realized that might be what I encountered. But here's the thing that still haunts me. I shot it 6 times, center mass, at close range, and it walked away. What kind of creature can take 6.38 rounds to the chest and just run off like it was nothing? Even with adrenaline, that's not possible for a human or any animal I know of. I'm 69 years old now. I've had a good life, a long career in security, and I've mostly put that night behind me. But sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, smelling that rotten egg stench, seeing those eyes reflecting in my headlights, and I wonder if it's still out there, in the Palmetto scrub off Highway 441, watching the houses that were eventually built where we had our encounter. The development is fully occupied now. Families living their lives, kids playing in yards, right where I stood and fired at something impossible. Sometimes I drive by there in broad daylight only and look at those houses. I wonder if any of the people living there have ever caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees at the edge of their property, or caught that distinctive smell on a hot summer night, and I wonder if they'd believe me if I told them what I saw. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in September of 2004. It's taken me years to work up the courage to write about it. My girlfriend and I both had the week off, and we planned this little camping trip near Snoqualmie Pass in Washington. Both of us were experienced campers, and we'd been to this general area before, but we wanted to find somewhere a bit more secluded this time. We drove out early Saturday morning, taking our time along the winding forest roads until we found this perfect little pullout off a service road that wasn't on any of the main camping maps. It was exactly what we were looking for. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines with a creek running about 50 yards away. The spot was far enough from the main roads that we couldn't hear any traffic, just the sound of the creek and birds. We spent the afternoon setting up our little dome tent and gathering firewood. By around 4 in the afternoon, we had everything organized, sleeping bags laid out, cooler unpacked, campfire pit dug and lined with stones. I remember feeling so content as I got the fire going while she prepped some food for dinner. The late September air had that perfect crispness to it, and the forest smelled amazing, that mix of pine and earth that you can only get in the Pacific Northwest. We cooked hot dogs over the fire and had some beers, talking about random stuff and enjoying being away from work and the city. I remember specifically commenting on how many birds were chirping around us and how active the forest seemed. The sun started setting around 6:30, and it got dark pretty quickly under the tree cover. That's when I first noticed something felt off. It wasn't immediate, more like a gradual realization that the forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, but utterly silent in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the creek seemed to be running quieter somehow. "Do you notice that?" I asked my girlfriend. She nodded slowly, looking around at the darkening trees. "It's really quiet all of a sudden." We both tried to laugh it off, but I could tell she was feeling the same unease I was. Then, maybe 30 minutes later, we heard it. A loud crack from somewhere in the forest behind us, like a massive branch breaking. We both jumped and looked at each other. "Probably just a dead branch falling," I said, trying to sound confident. But it didn't sound like a random branch fall. It sounded deliberate. We went back to roasting marshmallows, but the mood had shifted. We were both on edge, scanning the tree line every few minutes. Then, not even 5 minutes later, there was another crack, noticeably closer this time. My girlfriend grabbed my arm. "That's not just branches falling," she whispered. I nodded, not wanting to voice what I was thinking. Could be elk or deer moving through the woods, I told myself. But it didn't sound like hooves. It sounded heavier, more purposeful. We stayed by the fire until around 10, partly because the flames were reassuring, and partly because neither of us wanted to admit we were scared. Eventually, though, we decided to call it a night. I put out the fire carefully, making sure every ember was dead. The darkness that followed was absolute. The sky was completely overcast. No stars, no moon, nothing. Our headlamps carved weak cones of light into the pitch black as we brushed our teeth by the tent. We climbed inside, zipped up the tent door, and got into our sleeping bags. I set my flashlight on the floor between us, pointing up to create a small dome of soft light. We were both exhausted from the day, but too wired to sleep. That's when the noises started again. At first it was faint. A rhythmic knocking sound, wood on wood, always in sets of 3. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. It was distant at first, but unmistakably deliberate. My girlfriend and I lay completely still, listening. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, not wanting to speculate out loud. The knocking continued, growing progressively louder, closer. It wasn't random. It was moving toward us in a clear pattern. Each set of 3 knocks seemed to come from a slightly different location, circling around our campsite. Then, without warning, the screaming started. I've tried for years to describe this sound accurately, but words just fail. It began as a low, rumbling growl that quickly exploded into something so loud, so powerful that it physically vibrated the tent fabric. The scream was simultaneously high-pitched and guttural, with this horrific dual-tone quality that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was primal and terrifying, something between a roar and a scream, but with an intelligence behind it that made my blood run cold. My girlfriend grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug in. I was frozen, heart hammering against my ribs. Before we could even process what we'd heard, another scream erupted from the opposite side of our tent. That's when the true fear hit me. There were at least two of them out there on opposite sides of us. Each scream was immediately followed by more wood knocking, but no longer the distant, subtle sounds from before. Now it was like massive clubs being slammed against tree trunks with incredible force. Boom, boom, boom. The impacts were so powerful we could feel the ground vibrate beneath our sleeping bags. "What the fuck is happening?" my girlfriend whispered, tears in her eyes. I had no answer. We were at least 5 miles from the nearest campground, and these weren't human noises. No person could make that scream, and no human could hit a tree with enough force to make the ground shake. For the next hour, the screams and knocking continued, creating a perimeter around our tent. We could hear heavy footsteps now, branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed under significant weight. Whatever was out there was big, really big, and there were at least 2 of them, maybe more. Around midnight, one of them approached the tent directly. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I could hear heavy breathing, not like a person's breath, but deep, powerful exhales that carried through the night air. Then a scream erupted so close to the tent wall that my girlfriend yelped involuntarily and clapped her hands over her ears. I'm not ashamed to admit I started crying. The sound was physically painful, like it was drilling into my skull. 3 massive bangs followed, boom, 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 against a tree that couldn't have been more than 10 feet from our tent. The ground literally trembled. I remember thinking, this is how we die. I was convinced that whatever was out there was about to tear through our tent, but it didn't. Instead, it moved away, circling back into the forest, only to be replaced by the second creature approaching from another angle. This became their pattern, circling our tent, screaming, knocking on trees, moving away, and then returning from a different direction. Sometimes the wood knocking would echo from far away, only to suddenly reappear seconds later from the opposite side, impossibly fast for anything to have covered that distance. The worst moment came around 2 in the morning. The tent wall suddenly moved, just slightly, as something brushed against it from the outside. It wasn't aggressive, almost like a curious touch, but knowing the force behind those tree knocks, that gentle brush was somehow more terrifying. My girlfriend and I were clutching each other, trying not to make a sound. We'd turned off our flashlight hours earlier, hoping darkness might protect us somehow. What truly terrified me wasn't just the sounds or the physical power behind them. It was the clear intelligence directing it all. These weren't random animal movements or territorial displays. They were deliberately surrounding us, communicating with each other, making sure we knew they were there and that we couldn't escape. It felt like a cruel game designed to keep us trapped and terrified. For hours, this continued. The wood knocking would move farther away, giving us false hope that they were leaving, only to return louder and closer. The screams would stop for 15 or 20 minutes, then shatter the silence when we least expected it. By 3 in the morning, I was physically sick from fear, my body shaking uncontrollably. Around 4:30, when the first hint of pre-dawn light must have been touching the sky, though we couldn't see it through the clouds, everything went silent. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden absence of noise was almost as shocking as the screams had been. We waited, not moving, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Slowly, the normal forest sounds returned. A distant bird call, the soft rustle of wind through pine needles. By 6:30, weak daylight was filtering through the tent fabric, and we finally worked up the courage to unzip the door. I went out first, half expecting to see the campsite destroyed, but everything looked untouched. Our cooler still sat on the picnic table. The fire pit was just as we'd left it. If not for our shared experience, I might have convinced myself it had all been some bizarre shared nightmare. Then I walked to the edge of our clearing, and my blood went cold again. Several trees had fresh marks on them, deep scratches in the bark that couldn't have been made by any normal forest animal. One pine tree, easily 16 inches thick, had 3 distinct breaks in its trunk about 8 feet up, where something incredibly heavy had slammed into it. The wood was splintered and the marks were fresh, sap still oozing. And the smell, I'll never forget it. A musky, sour odor hung in the air around the damaged trees, something between wet dog, skunk, and something else I can't even describe. It wasn't there the day before, and it made my stomach turn. We packed up in record time, not speaking much, just working with silent efficiency born from fear. As we stuffed the tent into its bag, my girlfriend pointed to the ground where it had been. There, perfectly visible in the soft earth, was a partial impression of what looked like a massive footprint, at least 15 inches long with distinct toe marks. Neither of us said anything. We just worked faster. The drive home was quiet. What could we say? We both knew what had happened, but neither of us wanted to name it. Whatever those creatures were, they weren't bears or cougars or any recognized animal. They were showing us, with terrifying clarity, that the forest belonged to them. The wood knocking, the circling, the way they trapped us inside our tent, it was direct and meant for us. I've never gone back to that area, and I rarely camp anymore. Sometimes at night, I still hear those screams in my dreams, and I wake up with my heart pounding, convinced something is circling outside my bedroom, knocking rhythmically, waiting for me to come out. Story 12. I still remember it clear as day, even though it was over 40 years ago. April 26th, 1981, my 9th birthday. We were having a little family get-together at our place near St. Ambrose in Manitoba. Nothing fancy, just my parents, Grandma who lived with us, my aunt and uncle, and my cousins. I'd been begging for a new bike for months, dropping hints whenever I could. My old one was way too small, with the seat raised so high I could barely touch the pedals. When I unwrapped that shiny blue Schwinn with the banana seat, I nearly lost my mind. It was perfect. Even had those plastic streamers hanging from the handlebars. My cousin Jake wanted to try it right away, and I let him because, well, I was feeling pretty generous being the birthday boy and all. It wasn't even 5 minutes before Jake came back looking guilty. The pedal fell off, he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. I wasn't even mad, I was just excited to have the bike. Dad said we could fix it no problem, but he was busy talking with my uncle about some work stuff, so I figured I'd try to handle it myself. Our yard wasn't anything special, just a patch of trampled grass surrounded by bushes and trees. Beyond that were more trees, then fields, then more trees. That's Manitoba for you, especially back in 1981, when our area only had dirt roads cutting through the wilderness, no streetlights, no neighbors within shouting distance. Just us, the wind, and whatever animals happened to be passing through. It was about 8:30 in the evening, but being late April, it was still light out. One of those perfect spring evenings where the air feels clean and everything seems right with the world. I remember kneeling in the dirt by the side of the house, trying to figure out how to get the pedal back on the crank arm. The metal threads had gotten a bit dirty, and I was wiping them off with my t-shirt. I was so focused on fixing my new bike that I didn't notice anything was wrong until I heard my aunt's voice. At first it was just my name, like she was trying to get my attention. Then her tone changed. There was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Get up, run to me now, run, run. Her screaming startled me so bad I dropped the pedal. When I looked up, she was standing on our back porch, her face drained of all color. Her arm was stretched out, pointing behind me, but also motioning for me to come to her. My grandma was at the screen door of the house, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't understand what was happening. My first thought was maybe a bear had wandered into the yard. It happened sometimes, but bears didn't make my aunt scream like that. When I turned around to look in the direction they were pointing, my entire body went cold. About 30 yards away, partially hidden by the edge of the tree line, stood something I couldn't comprehend. It was tall, so tall it seemed impossible, 7 feet at least, maybe more. It was covered in hair, a light brownish-grey color, like dirty dishwater, not shaggy like you see in those fake Bigfoot photos, but not short either, just hair covering everything. What struck me most were its proportions. It was slim, not bulky like a bear. The arms hung down past its knees, longer than any human arms I'd ever seen, and it was standing upright, perfectly balanced on 2 legs. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we just stared at each other. I remember thinking how weird it was that I couldn't smell anything. Grandma always said bears and wild animals had a smell you could pick up if they were close, but there was nothing. Its face was... I still have trouble describing it. Not quite human, not quite animal. Dark eyes beneath a heavy brow, no snout like a bear, but not a flat face like ours either. Something in between. The strangest part was how it turned to look at me, not like an animal that had been startled, but with purpose. Like it had been watching me all along and was now simply acknowledging that I had finally noticed it. My aunt was still screaming. "Come here now, run!" I don't remember making the decision to move. 1 second I was frozen. The next, I was sprinting across the yard, the bike pedal forgotten in the dirt. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, but there was nothing except my aunt's panicked voice and my own ragged breathing. I crashed into my aunt on the porch, and she yanked me inside, slamming the door behind us. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, gasping for air. What was that? What was that? I kept asking, but my aunt just kept saying, I don't know, over and over. Her hands were shaking as she locked the door. Everyone came running. My mum from the living room, my dad and uncle from the garage. My little cousins huddled together by the fridge, confused and scared because they didn't know what was happening. "There's something out there," my aunt said, her voice trembling, standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. She pointed at me. Dad and Uncle Rob looked at each other, then immediately went for the gun cabinet in the hall. I watched my father load his hunting rifle while my uncle grabbed a flashlight. Mum tried to stop them, saying we should call the police, but the nearest station was 20 minutes away at least, and our phone service was spotty at best. "We're just going to look," Dad assured her. "Stay inside, keep the doors locked." I wanted to tell them more about what I'd seen, but I couldn't find the words. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? My grandma pulled me close, stroking my hair like she did when I was little and had nightmares, but this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Through the window, I watched my dad and uncle step cautiously into the yard, moving slow, the rifle ready. They headed toward where the thing had been standing, but even from inside, I could tell it was gone. There was a heaviness in the air, though, like right before a thunderstorm hits. They were out there for maybe 15 minutes. I remember checking the clock on the stove over and over, watching the minutes tick by. When they finally came back in, their faces were grim. "Did you see it?" I asked immediately. Uncle Rob shook his head. "No, but..." He looked at my dad. "There are footprints," Dad said quietly. "Big ones, not a bear." "I'm going to make a cast," Uncle Rob announced. He was always into that kind of stuff, collecting arrowheads, fossils, anything old or mysterious. He had plaster of Paris in his truck from some project he was working on. While the adults talked in hushed, urgent tones, I sat at the kitchen table, still trying to process what I'd seen. My cousin Jake sat across from me, peppered me with questions I couldn't answer. Was it a bear? Was it a monster? Did it have claws? Did it roar at you? I don't know what it was, I told him honestly. It was just watching me. The birthday cake sat forgotten on the counter. Nobody felt like celebrating anymore. Uncle Rob spent the next hour making a cast of one of the footprints. I wasn't allowed to go outside to look, but he brought it in later to dry on our porch. It was huge, easily twice the size of my dad's work boot, 5 toes, just like a human foot, but wider, with what looked like claws at the ends. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind in the trees outside my window made me freeze in terror. I kept thinking about those eyes watching me, how the creature had turned its head so deliberately to look at me. I pulled my blanket up to my chin and stared at the ceiling until dawn. In the days that followed, Dad and a couple men from town searched the woods behind our property. They found more footprints leading deeper into the forest, but they eventually disappeared where the ground got rocky. Uncle Rob kept the plaster cast, promising to show it to a friend of his who worked at the university in Winnipeg. Over the next few months, there were stories in our area about people hearing strange sounds at night, like a woman screaming in the distance, but no one else reported seeing anything like what I saw. Eventually, people stopped talking about it, and life went back to normal. Or as normal as it could be when you know something impossible is real. Uncle Rob passed away about 24 years ago. Before he died, he told me he'd given the cast to some researcher from the United States who was collecting evidence of similar sightings across North America. I wish I knew who had it now. I still live in Manitoba, though not in St. Ambroise anymore. Sometimes I drive out that way, past our old property. The house is gone now, torn down years ago, and new people built something bigger. The trees have been cleared back farther, and the dirt roads are paved. Progress, they call it. But every time I'm there, I find myself looking at that tree line, wondering if it's still out there somewhere in the deep woods, wondering if it remembers me the way I remember it, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run when my aunt called. I'm 50 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've gone hiking and camping countless times. I've hunted in those same woods. Nothing. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. My 9th birthday, April 26th, 1981. The day something watched me from the trees. The day everything I thought I knew about the world changed forever. Story 13. I've been hesitating to write this down for the longest time. It's been 36 years, and I still get a weird feeling in my stomach when I think about it. This happened back in June of 1987, when I was young and stupid enough to think solo backpacking in the Canadian wilderness was a good idea. I'd been planning this trip to Jasper National Park for months. The North Boundary Trail was supposed to be challenging but worth it. Pristine wilderness, incredible mountain views, and the solitude I was craving after a rough year. Looking back, I got way more solitude than I bargained for. I'd timed my hike to be early in the season, thinking I'd avoid the crowds. Mission accomplished there. I didn't see another human being for a solid week. Just me, my backpack, and whatever was watching from the trees. The first few days were exactly what I wanted. The trail was rough in spots where winter had done its damage, but the scenery was breathtaking. I spotted mule deer almost daily, their ears perking up when they caught my scent before bounding away. Twice I saw grizzlies, thankfully at a distance, and I made sure to keep it that way, giving them plenty of space and making noise as I hiked. I saw rabbits, marmots, and all the usual small critters you'd expect. The weather had been decent, cool mornings, warming to comfortable afternoons. I'd fallen into a good rhythm. Up with the sun, hiking by 7, making camp by 5 or so. I kept a detailed trail log, noting wildlife sightings and marking my progress on my topographic maps. It was clear I was the first person through that season. Trail maintenance hadn't happened yet, and I had to climb over several fallen trees and clear some minor debris myself. It was on day 7 when everything changed. I'd woken up to a misty morning, my tent fly damp with condensation. The fog was thick in the valleys, giving everything this eerie, muffled quality. I remember feeling slightly on edge, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was just the isolation finally getting to me. By mid-morning, the sun had burned off most of the mist, and I was making good time. The trail had been climbing gradually, winding through some pretty dense forest, tall pines and thick underbrush that sometimes crowded the path. I was breathing hard, sweating despite the cool air, when I came around a bend and started heading downward toward a boggy clearing. I was watching my footing on the descent. The trail was slick with pine needles and morning dew when I stopped dead in my tracks. Right there, crossing the trail at an angle, was a line of the most distinctive footprints I've ever seen. I'm not a tracker or anything, but I've done enough hiking to recognize animal prints. These weren't animal prints, at least not from any animal I recognized. My first thought was human, but that didn't make sense either. These prints were enormous, much larger than my own size 11 boots, and they were barefoot. 5 toes, clear as day, pressed into the soft earth of the trail. The footprints continued from the dense brush on my left, crossed the trail diagonally, and disappeared into the forest on my right. I knelt down to examine them more closely. The detail was incredible. You could see the individual toes clearly, the big toe slightly separated from the others, and 4 other toes in descending size. There was what looked like skin texture in the prints, tiny lines that reminded me of fingerprints but covering the entire sole. The foot had a distinct arch, giving it almost an hourglass shape, narrower in the middle than at the heel or ball. The prints were fresh, so fresh that the ridges between the toes still glistened with moisture, while the rest of the print was starting to dry slightly in the morning air. The trail had a light coating of pine needles and small debris from the forest. But inside these prints, the earth was clean, no leaves, no needles. Nothing had blown into them yet, though there was definitely a light breeze that morning. I remember thinking, this can't be more than an hour old. Probably less, maybe much less. For some stupid reason, my first thought was, must be some park wardens walking around without boots. Even as the thought formed, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. What park warden hikes through bare country barefoot and with feet that size? And I hadn't seen a single human being in a week. Why would I suddenly encounter barefoot rangers out here? But my brain was desperately trying to find a normal explanation. I stood up, looked around nervously, and continued hiking. I didn't take pictures. I didn't even make a cast, though I had plaster of Paris in my first aid kit for splinting, but it would have worked. I just kept going. Looking back, I can't believe how dumb that was. The scientific evidence of a lifetime, and I just walked away from it. As I hiked, my mind kept circling back to those footprints. They were roughly 50% larger than my own foot, and I don't have small feet. The toe spread was wider than a human's would be, like someone who had never worn shoes. And there was this presence to them. It's hard to explain, but they gave me this feeling of something powerful, having just been there. After about a kilometer, the reality of what I'd seen finally hit me. Those weren't human footprints. They couldn't be. The size, the freshness, the location. I'd been looking at Sasquatch tracks. Fresh Sasquatch tracks, from something that had crossed the trail less than an hour before I got there. My heart started pounding. I stopped and looked back down the trail, half expecting to see something massive emerge from the trees. Nothing did, but the forest suddenly seemed much darker, much more threatening than it had moments before. I picked up my pace considerably. The weight of my pack seemed to disappear as adrenaline kicked in. I wasn't running. That would have been stupid on that terrain, but I was moving as fast as I safely could. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me jerking my head around, scanning the trees. The geography of that area sticks in my memory. I was coming out of thick forest toward a boggy clearing surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. The valley narrowed ahead of me, and I remember thinking that anything following the valley would naturally funnel through this exact spot. The tracks had been heading toward higher ground, into denser forest. As I hiked, I kept looking for more tracks, but I didn't see any. The trail became rockier, less likely to show prints. I started making noise, talking to myself, occasionally singing off-key, anything to announce my presence. The last thing I wanted was to surprise whatever had made those footprints. That night was the longest of my life. I hiked much later than usual, wanting to put as much distance between myself and those tracks as possible. When I finally had to make camp, I chose an exposed area rather than my usual protected spot. I wanted visibility in all directions. I didn't sleep much, jerking awake at every sound, my headlamp and knife within easy reach. The next morning, I broke camp at first light and hiked out at a brutal pace. I cut my trip short by 3 days, pushing hard to reach the trailhead where my car was parked. Here's the thing that still haunts me. I've been an avid outdoorsman my whole life. I've seen all kinds of wildlife, including bears, wolves, and moose. I know tracks. I know what's supposed to be out there. Those prints weren't from anything in the guidebooks. They weren't bear, no claw marks, wrong shape. They weren't moose or elk, totally wrong formation. And they sure as hell weren't human. At least not any human I'd want to meet alone in the woods. The detail is what gets me. The dermal ridges, like fingerprints but on the whole foot. The cracks in the heel that looked like the kind of dry skin you get from walking barefoot. The way the toes had clearly flexed as whatever it was walked, gripping the soft earth. These weren't just impressions, they were a snapshot of something living, something massive, something that had passed by just minutes before me. I've told very few people about this over the years. My hiking buddies would just laugh, and everyone else would think I was crazy. But I know what I saw. For years afterward, I second-guessed myself, tried to find rational explanations. None fit. I even went back to that same area 2 years later with a friend, hoping to find something. We didn't. To this day, when I'm in the backcountry, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. I carry a camera now, always, but I've never seen tracks like that again, and part of me is grateful, because whatever left those prints was real, it was massive, and it was close enough that if it had wanted to find me, it absolutely could have. That day changed how I see the wilderness. It's still beautiful, still a place I love to be. But now I know there are things out there that defy explanation, things that move silently through the trees just out of sight. And sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, you find evidence they were there just moments before you arrived. Story 14. I still have goosebumps thinking about it, even though it happened years ago. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've spent most of my life in the wilderness, working as a professional hunting guide in Washington State. I've encountered black bears within 10 feet, stood my ground against mountain lions, and navigated wolf territory without issue. But what happened in the Cascade Mountains back in the summer of 2006? It was something entirely different. My buddy Aaron Miller and I had decided to do some pre-season scouting in a really remote section of the Cascades. We were looking for new hunting grounds for the upcoming fall season, somewhere untouched that could give our clients a better experience. We hiked about 7 miles off any established trail, following game paths and eventually making our own way through dense forest until we found this perfect hollow nestled between 2 steep ridges with a small creek running through it. The location was ideal, sheltered from wind, fresh water nearby, and completely isolated from any other humans. According to my GPS, the nearest road was over 12 miles away, and the closest hiking trail was at least 6 miles. This was proper backcountry. The kind of place where you don't expect to see another soul for days. We set up our camp around mid-afternoon. 2 small backpacking tents, a modest fire pit, and the usual gear. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough for a couple nights in the woods. After setting up, we ate some jerky and trail mix, then decided to scout the immediate area before dark. The forest was thick, mostly old-growth conifers with dense understory vegetation, perfect cover for deer and elk. Everything was normal until about an hour before sunset. We were sitting by our small fire, relaxing after exploring the area, when Aaron brought up the topic of Bigfoot. Now, I've always kept an open mind about these things. When you spend enough time in remote wilderness, you start to realize there's a lot we don't understand about what might be out there. But I wasn't a true believer either. "You know what would be funny?" Aaron said, grinning. "Let's do some of those Bigfoot calls like on those TV shows." I laughed and figured, why not? We were miles from anywhere, just two idiots in the woods having some fun. Aaron grabbed a thick stick and struck it hard against a nearby tree trunk. 3 solid knocks. We chuckled, and I took a turn, banging out a different pattern. 2 quick knocks, followed by a single one. We were still laughing when it happened. From the ridge above us, maybe 300 yards away, came 3 distinct knocks, mimicking my exact pattern. 2 quick, 1 single. We both froze. The smiles dropped from our faces. "Was that an echo?" Aaron whispered. I shook my head. No way. The timing was off for an echo, and it came from a different direction. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening intently. The forest had gone weirdly quiet. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just that heavy silence that sometimes happens in the woods, except this felt different, charged somehow. "Try something else," I suggested, my voice barely audible. Aaron nodded, then cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a long, deep howl. It wasn't particularly good. More like a guy imitating a wolf than anything else. We waited. 15 seconds of silence passed, then 30. We started to relax a bit, exchanging nervous smiles. Then it came. From the ridge to our east, a deep, guttural howl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard in my 20-plus years as a guide. It was lower, more powerful, almost ape-like, but with this weird modulation that sounded almost intentional. Before we could process what we'd heard, another call answered from the ridge to the west, then a third from somewhere north of us. They were calling to each other, communicating in a way that felt coordinated. "What the fuck is that?" Aaron whispered, his face drained of color. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because in that moment, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. As daylight faded, we built our fire up larger than we normally would. The temperature was dropping, but that wasn't why we wanted a bigger fire. Something was out there. Something was watching us. We heard the first footsteps around 8:30, just as full darkness settled in. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the forest, maybe 100 yards from camp. Too heavy for a deer, too rhythmic for a bear. The cadence was all wrong. It was bipedal, stepping with purpose. "Could be a moose," Aaron suggested, his voice betraying his doubt. I just shook my head. We both knew moose weren't common in this part of the Cascades, and moose don't walk in perfect bipedal strides. For the next hour, the footsteps circled our camp, never coming closer than about 70 yards, never retreating further than 150, just circling, watching. The fire cast long shadows into the surrounding forest, but beyond the light's reach was impenetrable darkness. We could see nothing, but we both felt eyes on us. Then the rock throwing started. Not big rocks, just small stones and pebbles coming from different directions, landing near our camp. Never hitting us, just landing nearby, like something testing our awareness, gauging our reactions. Around 10 o'clock, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just mimicking our earlier patterns, it was organized. A knock from the east ridge would be answered by one from the west, then a series of 3 rapid knocks from the north. They were communicating, coordinating, surrounding us. "We need to get out of here," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but the reality was grim. It was pitch black. We were miles from any trail, in challenging terrain. Trying to hike out now would be suicide, even without whatever was stalking us. Our best bet was to maintain the fire and wait for dawn. They haven't approached the fire, I pointed out. Let's keep it going until morning, then we pack up and get the hell out. Around midnight, our fire began to die down. We were running low on easily accessible firewood, and neither of us wanted to venture far from camp to gather more. The sounds had somewhat diminished. Occasional knocks in the distance, but the footsteps seemed to have retreated. Maybe they've lost interest, Aaron said hopefully. That's when our fire sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. The silence was immediate and absolute. No insects chirping, no nocturnal birds, nothing but the sound of our own breathing. I fumbled for my flashlight but couldn't find it in my panic. Aaron had his, but the batteries were weak, casting only a feeble glow that seemed to make the darkness beyond even deeper. Then we heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming directly toward our camp from the east. Not circling anymore. Coming straight at us, fast. Get in your tent, I hissed at Aaron, diving for my own shelter. There was no time to restart the fire, no time to find a weapon. Just pure animal instinct to take cover. I zipped the tent flap closed and lay perfectly still, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps got closer, heavier. The ground literally trembled with each impact. Whatever this was, it was massive. And it was coming right for us. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could hear deep, heavy breathing. Then came a smell. Wild, musky like wet fur, mixed with something else I can't even describe. The air felt electric, charged with a presence that was undeniably intelligent and unimaginably powerful. He lay frozen, unable to move, barely breathing. My tent wall bulged inward slightly, as if something was leaning close, sensing me inside. Then it happened. 3 explosive, huffing breaths, dominant, assertive, claiming territory. Each huff was so powerful it flattened the tent material toward me, like someone blowing out birthday candles, but with the force of a bellows. The sound was primal, visceral, half animal, half something else. I felt it more than heard it. A vibration that went through my entire body. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, the creature turned and crashed back into the forest, its footsteps thundering away with surprising speed for something so large. I heard Aaron's ragged breathing from his tent a few yards away, but couldn't find my voice to call to him. We stayed like that, paralyzed with fear, until the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees. Neither of us slept. Neither of us spoke. We just waited, listening to the occasional distant knocks that continued throughout the night. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed up with frantic efficiency. No breakfast, no coffee, barely any conversation beyond essential coordination. I noticed large, barefoot-like depressions in the soft earth near our tents. The impressions were nearly 18 inches long, deeply pressed into the ground, with 5 distinct toe marks. Nothing I've ever seen in all my years outdoors even comes close. We hiked out at a near run, barely stopping to rest. 7 miles of rough terrain covered in just under 3 hours. When we reached my truck, we threw our gear in and drove straight to the nearest town, barely speaking the whole way. I've been back in those mountains hundreds of times since then. I've guided hunts all over the Cascades, but I've never returned to that specific hollow, and I never will. I also never make Bigfoot calls as a joke anymore. What stands out most wasn't just the terror of that night, but the overwhelming sense of intelligence behind it all. These weren't just animals reacting to us. They were thinking, communicating, strategizing. They herded us like prey, contained us with fear. And then that final display, that huffing challenge over my tent, it was a message. Clear as day. This is our territory. You are here because we allow it. I've encountered nearly every predator in the North American wilderness. I've looked into the eyes of grizzlies and cougars. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever made me feel the way I felt that night. Watched, tested, evaluated, and ultimately spared. Aaron doesn't go into the backcountry anymore. He sold his gear and moved to the city. We don't talk about that night, but sometimes when we get together, there's this look we share, this understanding. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those 3 powerful huffs outside my tent, knowing that whatever made them could have ended me in seconds but chose not to, and wondering why. Story 15. I still can't explain what I saw that night on the Merrimack River. It's been over 3 years now, but every time I'm near running water or hear certain sounds at night, it all comes rushing back. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or goes looking for Bigfoot. I'm just an average guy who likes fishing and spending time outdoors with friends. But what happened that night changed something in me. It was early June, perfect weather for a day on the river. Me, Greg, Dave, and Mike had been planning this canoe trip for weeks. We all needed a break from work, and the Merrimack is one of our favorite spots. Good fishing, nice current, and plenty of sandbars for camping. We packed light, just fishing gear, a small cooler with beers and sandwich stuff, and our sleeping bags. We put in around 9 in the morning, 2 canoes with 2 guys each. The day was absolutely perfect. Warm but not hot, with that kind of blue sky that makes you glad to be alive. We spent the whole day floating downstream, fishing the deeper pools, and just shooting the shit like guys do when they're away from their regular lives. By late afternoon, we'd caught enough smallmouth bass for a decent meal. We cleaned them on a rock shelf near the water and cooked them over a small fire. Simple food always tastes better outdoors. We washed it down with a few beers. Nothing crazy, since we had to paddle the next day. As sunset approached, we found this perfect sandbar, a wide, flat stretch of clean sand with a gentle slope down to the water. The river narrowed a bit there, with thick woods on both banks. Across from our sandbar was a small ravine or draw that cut into the bank. I remember noticing it because it looked like a dark slash in the tree line. We pulled our canoes well above the waterline and secured them with our paddles stuck deep in the sand. No tents, just our sleeping bags laid out in a row on the open sandbar. The night was warm and the moon was incredible. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was bright enough to read by. You could see details across the river, shadows and all. That full moon cast this silvery light over everything, making the river look like flowing mercury. We stayed up for a while, talking around the remnants of our cook fire, but eventually turned in around 11. I fell asleep almost immediately, worn out from a day of paddling and sun. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch was in my bag, and I didn't check it. Based on the moon's position, I'd guess it was around 2 or 3 in the morning. I wasn't fully awake at first, just kind of drifting in that half-conscious state where you're aware but not really processing things. What pulled me fully awake was movement across the river. Something caught my eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been moving. I propped myself up on my elbows, trying to focus on that dark ravine area about 20 yards upstream from where we were sleeping. Then it emerged. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as something normal, maybe a bear, though they're not common in that area. But as it stepped fully out of the draw and into the moonlight, I knew immediately this wasn't anything I could explain. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing would have towered over me by at least 2 feet. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its upper body was enormous. The shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine, with this thick barrel chest, and it was covered completely in hair. Not clothes, not a suit, hair. In the moonlight, it looked dark, maybe dark brown or black, but it's hard to be sure in that lighting. The head is what really got to me. It wasn't a human head. It had this distinctive crest, almost like a ridge running front to back, and this heavy brow that shadowed where the eyes would be. The silhouette was nothing like a human skull. The most shocking thing was how it moved. It walked directly into the river on two legs, completely upright, completely deliberate. There was nothing awkward about its movement. It was smooth, purposeful, like it had done this crossing many times before. I was frozen. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just watched, trying to process what I was seeing. Then Greg stirred beside me. He must have sensed my tension, or maybe heard the subtle splash as this thing entered the water. "What is that?" Greg whispered, his voice tight with confusion or fear. The moment Greg spoke, something chilling happened. The creature turned at the waist, just the upper body, not its legs, and looked directly at us. It didn't stop walking, didn't break its stride, just turned and looked. I couldn't see its eyes in the shadow of that heavy brow, but I felt its gaze. I knew it saw us. I don't know why, but I responded with, "I don't know. Must be somebody ripping off cabins." Even as I said it, I knew it was ridiculous. This was no human. No human moves like that, looks like that, but it was like my brain was scrambling for any rational explanation. What happened next still amazes me. The creature continued crossing the river through a section I knew was deep and fast. Earlier that day, Dave had slipped off a rock there and had to swim hard to avoid being swept downstream. The current was strong enough that we'd all been careful when fishing that hole. But this thing walked through it like it was nothing. The water was about 4 feet deep in the middle, but it only reached its knees. It lifted its knees high with each step, pushing against the current that would have knocked any of us flat. I could actually hear the sound of the water cutting around its legs. This weird rushing noise, different from the normal river sounds. When it reached the far bank, it didn't scramble or climb. It just stepped out of the water and continued into the trees, disappearing within seconds. The entire sighting couldn't have lasted more than 20 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. Greg and I just lay there for a minute, not speaking. Finally, he whispered, "Did you see that?" "Yeah," I said. "What the fuck was that?" "I don't know, man. I don't know." We both lay awake for a long time after that. I kept staring at that spot where it had emerged, half expecting it to come back. Every shadow in the woods, every night sound had me on edge. I don't think either of us slept much after that. When morning came, it all seemed surreal. In the daylight, with birds chirping and the river flowing normally, what we'd seen seemed impossible. But Greg and I knew what we'd witnessed. We told Dave and Mike over breakfast. They laughed it off, of course. Mike suggested we'd seen a bear, or maybe some drunk guy wandering around. Dave just rolled his eyes and asked if we'd been sneaking extra beers. Their reaction discouraged us from even looking for tracks or other evidence, which I regret now. I wish we'd crossed the river to check that far bank, but at the time, I just wanted to pack up and get moving. The weirdest part? As we were loading the canoes, I noticed Greg staring at the river where the thing had crossed. The water there was moving fast, churning over submerged rocks. No way a person could have walked through that. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I asked him. He nodded. No human could cross there standing up. No way. We paddled out earlier than planned. No one mentioned cutting the trip short, but we all seemed eager to get back to civilization. The rest of the day felt off, like we were just going through the motions of finishing our trip. I've tried to rationalize what I saw in the years since. Maybe it was a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. But who hunts at 2 in the morning by wading through fast water? A bear standing unusually erect? But bears don't walk upright for that long. And they certainly don't have that distinctive head shape or move with that deliberate gait. What bothers me most is how it reacted when it heard Greg speak. That deliberate turn to look at us without breaking stride. That wasn't startled behavior. It knew we were there, assessed us, and decided we weren't worth bothering with. That level of intelligence, that deliberate calculation, it wasn't animal behavior as I understand it. I haven't been back to that stretch of the Merrimack since. Greg and I have talked about it a few times, but never when the others are around. I can tell it affected him the same way it affected me. You see something like that, something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught, and it changes how you look at the world. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw that night under that bright full moon. I know the sound of water cutting around those massive legs. And I know the feeling of being seen and assessed by something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep at night, I still see that silhouette stepping into the moonlight, and I wonder if it's out there still, crossing rivers in the dark when it thinks no one is watching. Story 16. It's been almost 3 decades, but I still can't get that night out of my head. Spring of 1996. I was 20 years old, heading back from Mississippi State to visit my folks in Louisiana for the weekend. Like a typical broke college student, I was driving my beat-up Toyota Corolla that had more miles on it than I care to remember. That particular night, I was running way behind schedule. I'd stayed late, helping my roommate move some furniture, and by the time I hit the road, it was already past midnight. I remember checking my watch as I crossed the Mississippi State line just after 2 in the morning. The roads were dead quiet. There was this massive construction project happening on the main highway connecting Mississippi and Louisiana at the time, causing terrible backups even during regular hours. My buddy had told me about some back roads that would bypass all that mess. Being 2 in the morning and exhausted from a full day of classes, followed by moving furniture, I figured taking the shortcut made sense. I should have just stuck to the damn highway. The back roads were pitch black. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but dense forest on both sides. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the road was so narrow that the trees seemed to be closing in. My radio was busted, so I was just humming to myself to stay awake, keeping a steady 45 miles per hour on these unfamiliar roads. I had my brights on, thank God for that, otherwise I probably would have plowed right into it. At first, I just saw a shape ahead in the distance. Nothing unusual about that in rural areas. Probably a deer, I thought. You see them all the time, crossing roads at night. But as I got closer, something felt off. The silhouette was all wrong for a deer. Too tall, too upright. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was clearly walking on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong for a human. Too big, way too big, and covered in what looked like fur or hair. I remember my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter, knuckles probably turning white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone in a costume, but out here at 2 in the morning, that made no sense. I was probably 50 yards away when it turned toward my car. That's when every hair on my body stood up. This was no person in a costume. It was standing in the middle of the lane, completely unafraid of my approaching car. My foot moved to the brake pedal instinctively, but I was still trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure was massive, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and broad, so much broader than any human I'd ever seen. When I was about 30 yards away, my brain finally caught up with my eyes. This was something I couldn't explain, and I hit the brakes hard. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, stupid I know, and I nearly smacked my head on the steering wheel. The car's tires locked up on the gravel, and I felt the back end sliding out. Before I knew it, I was spinning. The world outside my windows became a blur of dark trees, and my headlights sweeping across the road. I spun a full 180 degrees and came to a stop, my engine stalling out. When everything stopped moving, I was facing back the way I came, and the creature was directly in front of my car, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, fully illuminated in my headlights. I'll never, ever forget what I saw in those next few seconds. It was real. So undeniably, impossibly real. The creature's entire body was covered in this light golden brown hair, almost a honey blonde color. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect from a wild animal. It had a strange, almost groomed quality to it, with these darker patches scattered throughout. The hair seemed shorter on its face, which was slightly darker than the rest of its body. I could clearly see its facial features. strangely human-like, but not. There wasn't a snout like a bear or wolf would have, no animal ears that I could see, just this flat, wide nose and deep-set eyes. What still haunts me to this day was how it reacted. It didn't run, it didn't charge. Instead, it slowly raised one massive, hair-covered hand up to shield its eyes from my headlights, just like a human would. The gesture was so deliberate, so intelligent. We locked eyes. I'm sure of it. Through the windshield, across 40 feet of empty road, this creature and I made direct eye contact. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel. My mind was screaming at me to restart the car, to reverse, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. Time seemed to stretch out forever in that moment. Maybe it was only a couple of seconds, but it felt like an eternity, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Then, with a casual deliberateness that seemed almost insulting, it turned away from me and walked, not ran, walked, into the tree line at the side of the road. It moved with this smooth, rolling gait, not jerky or animal-like at all. Its arms swung at its sides naturally, like a person's would. The trees swallowed it up, and just like that, it was gone. No sounds of crashing through the underbrush, no breaking branches, nothing, just silence. I sat there for what felt like forever, my car dead in the middle of the road, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key turned to restart the car. When the engine finally caught, I slammed the car into gear and took off like a bat out of hell, forgetting completely about any kind of safe driving speed on these back roads. I must have done 70 or 80 the rest of the way home, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it running after me. I didn't tell anyone at first, not my parents when I finally got to their house at around 4 in the morning, not my friends back at college. Who would believe me? I'd sound crazy. I convinced myself maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe my exhausted mind had played tricks on me, but I knew. Deep down, I knew what I'd seen. About a week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I went to the university library. This was before Google was really a thing, so I couldn't just search tall, hairy creature Mississippi. I found myself in the folklore section, flipping through books about American myths and legends. That's when I found it. In a Time Life book series about the unexplained, there it was. Descriptions and alleged sightings of something called Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The descriptions matched what I'd seen perfectly: the height, the hair, the human-like qualities. As I sat there reading account after account, this cold chill ran up my spine. Other people had seen it too. I wasn't crazy. There were reports from the Pacific Northwest, which I expected, but also from the South, Louisiana, Arkansas, and yes, Mississippi. I hadn't known that before. I thought these things were supposed to be in Washington or Oregon, not walking across back roads in Mississippi. The more I read, the more certain I became about what I'd encountered. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate gesture of shielding its face from the light. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else entirely. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, but who would be out there at 2 in the morning? And no human could be that tall or move like that. Maybe it was a bear. But bears don't walk upright for that long, or with that smooth a gait. Their proportions are all wrong. Every explanation I come up with falls apart when I remember those eyes looking into mine. The unmistakable intelligence there. The calm, almost dismissive way it turned and walked away, like I wasn't worth bothering with. I never went back to that stretch of road again. Never took that shortcut, even in broad daylight. I couldn't bring myself to. Even now, 28 years later, when I drive through rural areas at night, I keep my eyes fixed on the road ahead, afraid of what I might see in my headlights. For years, I've debated sharing this story. Most people would think I'm making it up, or that I was just tired and saw a bear or something, but I know what I saw. It was no bear, no human, no known animal. It was something else, something that wasn't supposed to exist, but was standing right there in front of me on that lonely back road. I still can't explain how something that big could disappear so completely, so quietly into the woods, or why it was out there in the first place, or why it seemed so unbothered by me, a human seeing it. That's what stays with me most. Not the fear of the encounter, but the questions it left behind. What was it doing out there? Are there more? How have they remained hidden for so long? I don't expect answers. I've made my peace with that. But I know what I saw that night in the spring of 1996 on a dark back road between Mississippi and Louisiana. And no one will ever convince me otherwise. To story 17, I'm still having trouble sorting through what I experienced back in early March of 1998. It's been years, but I can't shake it from my mind. I've never been much for sharing personal stuff online, but after finding this community, I feel like maybe someone here will understand or have had similar experiences. I'd gone backpacking alone near the horse trails in Jackson County, just south of Brown County, Indiana. I'd been through those woods dozens of times before and knew them pretty well. Nothing special about this trip, just wanted some time away from everything, you know, clear my head. The weather was typical for early March in southern Indiana, chilly but manageable. During the day, it was probably in the mid-40s, dropping into the 30s at night. I remember wearing my old green Columbia jacket, the one with the torn pocket that I still haven't fixed. I'd hiked about 7 miles that day, following some less traveled paths. My legs were tired, but it was that good kind of tired that comes after a solid day outdoors. By evening, I found a decent spot to set up camp on a small ridge, about 100 yards above one of the main horse trails. There was a small ravine nearby with a stream running through it. It was a pretty ideal spot, elevated enough to stay dry if it rained, flat enough for my tent, and close to water. I could hear the stream gurgling below, a peaceful sound I'd fallen asleep to many times before. I got my little one-person tent set up and gathered some firewood. The sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across my campsite. I remember thinking how quickly it gets dark in the woods, especially in early spring, before the trees leaf out completely. I got a small fire going and started heating water for my freeze-dried meal, beef stroganoff, I think it was. Not gourmet, but after hiking all day, anything hot tastes amazing. I was stirring my dinner when I first heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, something moving down in the ravine to the east of my campsite. Nothing alarming initially. Woods are full of deer, raccoons, and other animals, especially around dusk when they start moving around. But something about this noise seemed different, heavier, more deliberate. I paused with my spoon mid-air, listening. There it was again. A distinct sound of something large moving through the underbrush, breaking small branches. Too heavy for a deer, I thought. Maybe a black bear, though they're pretty uncommon in that part of Indiana. Then I had another thought. Maybe it was someone looking for morel mushrooms. It was a bit early in the season and getting dark, but locals sometimes know spots where they come up first. Still, who would be out mushroom hunting in near darkness? I set my dinner aside and grabbed my hunting knife and Maglite flashlight. The knife was more for comfort than anything else, a buck knife my dad had given me years before. The flashlight was one of those big heavy ones that doubles as a weapon if needed. I still have both of them. I made my way down the slope toward the ravine, using tree trunks to steady myself on the way down. The dried leaves from the previous fall crunched under my boots, making it impossible to move quietly. I called out, "Hello, anyone down there?" No response. The movement had stopped as soon as I called out. That made me more nervous, not less. Animals usually scurry away when they hear a human voice. A person would typically respond. I reached the edge of the ravine and shined my flashlight down toward the stream. The beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating patches of the forest floor, bare tree trunks, and the glint of water in the small creek. "Hello," I called again, my voice sounding strangely thin in the evening air. That's when I saw it. About 40 feet away, standing partially hidden behind a cluster of trees near the stream, was a figure. At first glance, in that quick sweep of my flashlight, my brain tried to process it as a person. It was standing upright on two legs. But even in that first moment, something felt wrong. Very wrong. It was tall, incredibly tall. I'm 6 feet myself, and this thing towered over me by at least a foot, maybe more. 7 feet at minimum. But it wasn't just the height that made my stomach drop. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur. Not like clothing, but like it was part of its skin. The hair seemed matted in places, especially around what I assumed were its shoulders. The build was massive, broad-shouldered and thick through the torso, with long arms that hung lower than a human's would. But it was the head that truly froze me in place. It had a strange, conical shape, pointed at the top and widening toward the bottom. And the face, God, the face wasn't human. I couldn't make out details clearly in the limited light, but I could see two dark eyes set forward on the skull, reflecting my flashlight beam briefly with a dull, reddish glow. There was no distinct nose that I could see, just a flattened area where a nose should be. The mouth area was dark, possibly open slightly. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. My hand holding the flashlight started trembling, making the beam dance around the creature's upper body. I felt the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stand up, and a wave of cold washed over me, despite the exertion of hiking down the ravine. Then my survival instinct kicked in. I yelled as loudly as I could, not words, just a primal shout meant to scare it away. In retrospect, I'm not sure if that was the smartest thing to do, but it was pure instinct. The creature's reaction was immediate and disturbing. Instead of running away, it moved sideways into the stream with a quickness that seemed impossible for something its size. Its movements were both fluid and jerky at the same time, like it could cover ground incredibly fast, but did so in strange, uneven bursts. It ducked behind another tree, then moved to another, then back again. This continued for several minutes. This bizarre game of hide and seek where it would peer around a tree trunk, then duck away when I pointed my flashlight at it. I kept the light trained in its direction, my knife held out in front of me. Though what good a 6-inch blade would do against something that size, I don't know. The whole time, it made no sound. Not a grunt, not a breath, not even splashing noises when it moved through the water, just the cracking of twigs and rustling of leaves when it moved. What terrified me most was that it seemed to be studying me. This wasn't an animal reacting out of fear or aggression. It felt calculated, intelligent, like it was trying to figure out what I was and what I might do next. After what must have been 5 or 6 minutes of this bizarre standoff, the creature suddenly turned and ran, or maybe loped is a better word, downstream through the creek bed. Its movement was unlike anything I've ever seen, covering ground in these strange, bounding steps that seemed to eat up distance. It disappeared around a bend in the ravine within seconds. I stood there, heart pounding in my ears, unsure if I should run back to my camp or stay put. Finally, I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed in the direction it had gone until I reached the slope leading up to my campsite. Then I turned and scrambled up as fast as I could, slipping on leaves and grabbing at saplings to pull myself up. When I reached my camp, my fire was still going, my half-eaten dinner sitting where I'd left it. I grabbed more wood and built the fire up as big as I dared. There was no way I was sleeping in my tent that night. Too vulnerable. Instead, I sat with my back against a large tree trunk, my knife in one hand and flashlight in the other, facing the direction of the ravine. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the slight breeze made me jump. I kept thinking about my truck, parked at a trailhead about 4 miles away. But to get there, I'd have to hike in the direction the creature had gone. No way was I doing that in the dark. So I stayed put. I fed the fire all night, burning through my entire wood supply and gathering more from the immediate area around my camp. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness, and my back ached from sitting against the tree. But fear is one hell of a stimulant. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees, I quickly packed up my gear. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely roll my sleeping bag. I left some food and trash behind, something I'd never normally do, and hit the trail at a near run. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way back to my truck, half expecting to see that tall, hairy figure emerging from the trees. I made it back without incident and drove home in a daze. For days afterward, I jumped at every sound. I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. When I closed my eyes, I saw those dull, reddish eyes staring back at me. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a man in some kind of suit, but who would be out in the remote woods alone, dressed like that? And the movement. No human could move that way. A bear standing on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong, and it moved bipedally with too much ease. I've spent hours researching online, looking at reports of Sasquatch sightings in Indiana. There aren't many, and most people would laugh at the idea of a Bigfoot in southern Indiana. It's not remote enough, they say, too populated. But I know what I saw. I haven't been back to those woods alone since then. I've gone hiking with groups in other areas. But something changed for me that night. The forest used to be a place of comfort for me, a second home. Now it's a place of uncertainty. I still don't know what I encountered on that March evening, but I know it was real. And I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in those Indiana woods. It's been 25 years, and I still wake up sometimes with the image of that conical-headed figure burned into my mind, still feel the primal fear that gripped me when those inhuman eyes met mine. Story 18. I've kept this to myself for far too long, nearly 45 years to be exact. It's not something I talk about casually, not after the ridicule we faced when we first tried to tell people what we saw, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened in the winter of '78 in Pike National Forest, behind Pikes Peak near Colorado Springs. My buddy Tom and I were really into winter camping back then. We were in our 20s, felt invincible, and loved the solitude of the mountains when most people were huddled indoors. We'd been out there for 3 days already. The snow was brutal that year, waist deep in most places. But we had decent gear and knew what we were doing, or at least we thought we did. That morning started like any other on our trips. I remember it was freezing cold, probably around 10 degrees, the kind of cold that makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe in. We'd just finished breakfast. Instant oatmeal and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. I can still taste that metallic flavor from the camp stove. Tom suggested we explore a bit before packing up camp. We were getting restless just sitting around, and even though the snow was deep as hell, we figured we'd follow what looked like a game trail that ran along this ridge above the valley floor. Animals always know the easiest paths, right? We strapped on our snowshoes, those old-school wooden ones with rawhide webbing, not the fancy aluminum ones people use now. Even with them, we were sinking pretty deep. I remember the sound of the snow crunching beneath us and how the trees occasionally dumped powder on our heads when we brushed against them. About an hour in, Tom stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. He was staring down at something in the snow, not saying anything. "What's up?" I asked. He just pointed. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There were depressions in the snow, footprints, but not like any I'd ever seen. They were unmistakably foot-shaped, like human prints, but enormous. I'm talking at least 16 inches long, maybe more, and wide too, wider than both our boots put together. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. They were barefoot prints, in waist-deep snow, in the dead of winter, in the Colorado high country. I remember looking at Tom, and he had this expression I'd never seen before. Not exactly fear, but a kind of confused awe. Neither of us said what we were thinking. We didn't need to. "Should we follow them?" Tom asked after a while. I should have said no. Every instinct told me to turn around, head back to camp, and pretend we never saw them, but curiosity is a powerful thing. Yeah, let's see where they go, I said, trying to sound casual despite the pounding in my chest. The tracks cut a straight line across the rise we were on. That's another thing that struck me. There was no wandering, no hesitation. Whatever made these prints knew exactly where it was going. The stride was massive, easily twice what mine would be, even running, but there was no sign of running or even struggling through the deep snow. It was like whatever made these tracks just walked normally, as if the snow wasn't even there. We followed them for about half a mile. The whole time, neither of us talked much. I kept thinking about how cold my feet were inside my insulated boots, multiple pairs of wool socks, and snowshoes. Yet here were barefoot prints, just cutting through the landscape like it was a spring day. The tracks led toward a spot where two mountain ridges came together, forming a kind of natural gateway to the higher elevations. As we approached this point, the snow got even deeper. We were struggling now, even with our gear. The drifts were chest-high in places, and we had to practically swim through some sections. But those tracks, they continued on without the slightest indication of difficulty. The stride never shortened. The depth of the prints remained consistent. Whatever made them had walked through snow deep enough to bury a man without breaking its rhythm. We reached a point where we simply couldn't go any farther. The snow was too deep, and we weren't equipped for that kind of trek. But those tracks just continued on, heading straight into the higher country like an arrow shot from a bow. Standing there, breathing hard from exertion, I felt something I'd never experienced before or since. A profound sense that I was glimpsing something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. It wasn't just the size of the prints, or that they were barefoot in winter. It was the absolute casualness with which whatever made them had moved through terrain that was nearly impassable for us. I remember looking up toward where the tracks were heading, into that higher, more remote wilderness, and feeling relieved that we couldn't follow any farther. Some primal part of me knew we shouldn't. "We should head back," Tom said, his voice unusually quiet. "Getting late." It wasn't really getting late. It was maybe early afternoon. But I nodded immediately. We both wanted an excuse to turn around. The trek back to camp was silent. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. The forest felt different now, like we'd crossed some invisible line from the world we knew into something else. Every crack of a branch or distant rustle made me jump. When we got back to camp, we packed up quickly. Neither of us suggested staying another night as we'd originally planned. We just wanted to get back to civilization. On the drive home, we finally talked about it. We went through all the possibilities. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs, but the prints were clearly feet, not paws. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but how would they have moved through that snow without showing any signs of struggle? Maybe it was some kind of weird snow formation, but they were consistent for hundreds of yards. We never said Bigfoot or Sasquatch out loud. It seemed too ridiculous, too National Enquirer. We were rational guys after all. But what else could leave human-like barefoot tracks that size in winter conditions that had us struggling with all our gear? When we got back home, we did tell a few people, close friends, family members. Big mistake. The reactions ranged from amused disbelief to outright mockery. My brother-in-law, who fancied himself an outdoorsman, suggested we'd been drinking too much camp coffee. Tom's girlfriend thought we were making it up for attention. One friend even suggested we'd had carbon monoxide poisoning from our stove. After a while, we just stopped talking about it. Tom and I would occasionally exchange a look when someone mentioned hiking in that area, or when Bigfoot came up in conversation, but we didn't discuss it, even between ourselves. It was easier that way, but I never stopped thinking about it. I've gone back to Pike National Forest many times over the years, though never again to that specific area in winter. Something about those tracks fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. The mountains no longer feel empty to me. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters since then. It's amazing how many people have seen these tracks in remote areas, always with the same characteristics: unnaturally large, clearly foot-shaped, and moving through difficult terrain with impossible ease. What stayed with me most is the indifference those tracks showed to conditions that had us struggling for every step. There was something almost casual about them, like whatever made them was completely at home in an environment that was trying its best to kill us. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we'd been able to keep following those tracks. Would we have caught a glimpse of whatever made them? Would it have been aware of us following? Was it already aware? That's the thought that still keeps me up some nights. Those tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old, judging by the lack of snow build-up inside them, which means whatever made them was nearby. Maybe it even saw us. Maybe it was watching as we followed its trail, curious about these bundled-up creatures struggling through snow it could stride through effortlessly. I'm 68 years old now. I've been all over the world, seen incredible things, but nothing has ever made me question my understanding of reality like those tracks did. The way they cut through that snow without effort, heading into country too rough for us to follow. It was like they were made by something that belonged there in a way we never could. I've never been able to explain what we found that day. Neither has Tom, though we finally started talking about it again a few years back after decades of silence. We're still not sure what made those tracks, but we both know what we saw, and we both know it was real. I'm not asking you to believe me, just know that there are things out there in the wilderness that don't fit neatly into our understanding of what's possible. And if you're ever in the mountains in winter and come across barefoot tracks in the snow that look like they belong to something that walks like a man but isn't quite human, don't follow them. Some mysteries are better left unexplored.